What if some of the best, healthiest vegetables just disappeared from our plates? Long ago, medieval farmers grew superfoods that most people have forgotten. Let's dig into them and see what we've been missing. First up, skirret. This superstar root vegetable of the Middle Ages has mysteriously disappeared from modern farming. Unlike today's popular carrots, which demand constant attention, skirret was the perfect low-maintenance crop. Once planted, these sweet roots quietly multiplied underground, creating a hidden treasure trove of food with almost no effort from farmers. It's like having a savings account that grows vegetables instead of interest. The taste is what made skirret truly special. Naturally sweeter than carrots or parsnips, these slim white roots were so delicious they earned royal fans. Medieval nobility couldn't get enough of them and demanded skirret be grown in palace gardens. Talk about a vegetable with a royal fan club. What made skirret particularly valuable in medieval times was its reliability. During harsh winters when other crops failed, these hardy roots continued providing nourishment. Old farming texts describe them as the comfort of the poor man's table when fields lay barren. Perhaps most impressive is the skirret's versatility. Medieval cooks roasted them, boiled them, added them to stews, and even made sweet pies with them. They were essentially the medieval equivalent of potatoes before potatoes arrived in Europe. These roots were so useful, they deserved their own coat of arms. But somewhere along the way, this incredible vegetable faded into obscurity. Modern farming favored faster-growing, larger roots. Meanwhile, another forgotten plant was causing quite a stir in medieval gardens. Romans first brought this bold plant to Britain, where medieval farmers quickly fell in love with it. But Alexander's wasn't content staying in neat garden rows. This veggie had the ambition of a weed and the taste of a delicacy. The medieval equivalent of finding out your annoying neighbor is actually a great cook. What made Alexander special? Every single part was edible: stems, leaves, flowers, roots, and seeds. Medieval people ate the young shoots like celery, used the flowers in salads, and ground the seeds as a pepper substitute. The leaves added a strange but pleasant flavor somewhere between parsley and celery to soups and stews. The plant grows up to 6 feet tall with bright yellow flowers that attract beneficial insects. It thrives in coastal areas, cliffs, and roadsides without any human help. It's the freelance vegetable of the plant world, showing up uninvited but doing good work. Despite its usefulness, Alexander's gradually disappeared from our diets. By the 1700s, celery had taken its place in gardens and kitchens across Europe. Today, most people walk past it growing wild without recognizing this once valued food source. While Alexander's boldly spread everywhere, another medieval favorite had a more dignified presence in gardens. Why did one of the most useful plants of the Middle Ages vanish from our gardens? Good King Henry deserves a comeback. Unlike the rebellious Alexanders, Good King Henry starts with a mystery. Nobody knows why it got such a royal name. What we do know is that it was everywhere in medieval Europe, growing both wild and in carefully tended gardens. Growing Good King Henry is about as easy as growing dust on a bookshelf. It practically takes care of itself, sprouting year after year without replanting. If plants could fill out job applications, Good King Henry would list extreme reliability as its top skill. The nutritional value would impress modern health experts. It contains more iron than spinach and high levels of vitamin C, critical nutrients often missing in medieval diets. During spring food shortages, its early leaves provided life-saving nutrition. Medieval cooks used the young shoots like asparagus, mature leaves like spinach, and flower buds like tiny broccoli. It was the medieval version of a 3-in-1 kitchen gadget, except it actually worked. Folk medicine valued Good King Henry too. Its leaves treated wounds while root tea served as a gentle laxative. In some regions, it was called all good because of its many uses. As agriculture became more commercial, this humble but hardy plant fell out of favor. Is it a root? Is it an oyster? Medieval farmers weren't quite sure what to make of salsify. This strange root vegetable has one of the most peculiar flavors in the plant kingdom. Salsify is the vegetable equivalent of someone showing up at a costume party dressed as seafood, only to win the Most Convincing Costume award. When cooked properly, salsify genuinely tastes like oysters. This strange quality made it incredibly valuable during medieval times, especially for religious folks who couldn't eat meat or fish on certain days. Monastery records from the 1400s show it was grown specifically as a fish substitute during Lent. Two types existed in medieval gardens, white salsify and black salsify. Both have long, thin roots with dark skin that must be peeled before cooking. The vegetable world's version of don't judge a book by its cover. Beneath that ugly exterior hides a gourmet treat. Winter made salsify truly shine. It was one of the few fresh vegetables available during the coldest months, staying in the ground through freezing temperatures. Medieval people would simply dig it up as needed throughout winter. Once harvested, it could be stored for months without spoiling. In a world without refrigeration, this made it extremely valuable. Modern farming moved away from salsify because it grows slowly and looks unusual. Speaking of unusual looks, medieval people had another favorite that modern folks would find truly bizarre. If someone served a wrinkled, mushy fruit today, most people would politely decline. But medieval folks, they considered it a delicacy worth waiting for. The medlar looks like a small brown apple with an open bottom showing its 5 seeds. Fresh off the tree, it's rock hard and so bitter it's completely inedible. But medieval gardeners knew its secret. Medlars need to blet before eating. Bletting is basically controlled rotting, where the fruit sits for weeks until it turns soft and brown. Medieval dessert menus were apparently created by people with extremely low standards and incredible patience. Once properly bletted, the medlar's flesh turns to a sweet cinnamon applesauce consistency that medieval people absolutely loved. Cookbooks from the 1200s contain dozens of recipes for medlar tarts, jellies, and wines. Unlike salsify, which hid its value beneath an ugly exterior, medlars proudly displayed their oddness. The fruit's unusual open-bottom shape earned it some colorful nicknames in medieval times, many too crude to mention here. Let's just say medieval farmers had a particular anatomical comparison in mind and leave it at that. What made medlars special was their timing. They ripen in late autumn and were one of the last fresh fruits before winter. After bletting, they could be stored for several more weeks, providing rare sweet treats during the darkest days of the year. Modern agriculture abandoned medlars for faster crops with longer shelf lives. Today's consumers want produce that looks perfect immediately, not fruit that needs weeks to become edible. While medlars demanded patience, our next forgotten vegetable was almost too eager to please. Unlike the picky medlar with its need for special treatment, chickweed had no grand history of cultivation. It was simply everywhere. This tiny leaved plant with delicate white flowers popped up in every garden, field, and pathway across medieval Europe. Chickweed is like that uninvited guest who shows up at every party but brings enough food to make everyone happy about it. Medieval gardeners couldn't send out no chickweed invitations that worked. Medieval farmers didn't plant chickweed. They couldn't have stopped it if they tried. It grows in any soil, sprouts in any season above freezing, and produces thousands of seeds from each plant. Instead of just pulling it as a weed, medieval people recognized its value and harvested it for free food. The tender leaves could be gathered year-round in most places. Fresh chickweed contains about 7 times more vitamin C than an equal weight of oranges. If vegetables had medieval job titles, chickweed would have been royal provider of vitamin C when nothing else is growing. Peasants gathered it for everyday meals, but records show that noble households also served it during winter months when green vegetables were scarce. Beyond the dinner table, chickweed had medicinal uses too. Its cooling properties made it useful for skin irritations, and chickweed tea was given for fever and inflammation. Modern agriculture declared war on chickweed with herbicides, labeling this nutritious plant as a nuisance. While chickweed fought for respect, another medieval vegetable suffered from its unfortunate name. No one wants to eat something called scorzonera. Sounds like a disease, doesn't it? Sorry, I can't come to school today. I've got a bad case of scorzonera. Yet this unfortunately named vegetable was a medieval garden staple. The name actually comes from the Italian word scorzone, meaning venomous snake. Early herbalists believed this black-skinned root could cure snake bites. While that medical claim proved false, medieval people discovered something more valuable. Scorzonera was delicious and incredibly nutritious. Often confused with black salsify, their close relatives, scorzonera has a longer, straighter root with black skin and white flesh inside. The taste is milder and sweeter than salsify, with subtle hints of asparagus and nuts. What made scorzonera remarkable was its storage abilities. Harvested in autumn, these roots could be buried in sand in a cool cellar and would stay fresh until the following summer. Few other vegetables offered this kind of food security in medieval times. Cultivation records from the 1500s show scorzonera was especially popular in monastery gardens. The monks valued it for its flavor during fasting periods and its medicinal properties. Medieval doctors prescribed scorzonera tea for purifying blood and calming stomach problems. The best part about growing scorzonera? You can impress your neighbors by casually mentioning, "I'm just heading out to harvest my scorzonera," which makes you sound like you either own an exotic sports car or are about to perform a magic spell. The decline of scorzonera came with modern grocery stores and refrigeration. When fresh produce became available year-round, vegetables that required long storage periods lost their appeal. From magical snake cure to forgotten roots, scorzonera gave way to more familiar vegetables. Oddly enough, Welsh onions are neither from Wales nor are they true onions. They're the medieval vegetable version of those fake designer products that somehow work better than the real thing. The actual origin of Welsh onions is East Asia, likely reaching Europe through trade routes around the 1200s. Medieval farmers appreciated this versatile plant that provided fresh greens year after year. What made them special? They're perennial, meaning once planted, they return year after year without replanting. Each plant gradually multiplies, forming clumps that can be divided. One medieval gardening text claims a single Welsh onion plant could feed a family for 10 years through constant division. Welsh onions served a purely practical purpose, providing a steady supply of fresh green onion tops when other vegetables were scarce. Medieval cooks used the hollow green shoots to flavor soups, stews, and salads. The most valuable feature was their winter hardiness. In many regions of Europe, Welsh onions stayed green through all but the harshest winters, providing crucial vitamins during the leanest months. Welsh onions might be the only food that solved an identity crisis by having an identity crisis of its own. Not Welsh, not a true onion, yet perfectly comfortable being exactly what it is. Medieval farmers treasured these reliable plants, but modern agriculture favored true onions for their larger bulbs. Meanwhile, another misunderstood plant was fighting for recognition. Unlike Welsh onions that medieval farmers deliberately planted, fat hen just showed up. This wild green volunteered in fields, gardens, and waste places throughout Europe, and medieval people were smart enough to eat it instead of just pulling it out. Fat hen is basically the uninvited dinner guest who turns out to be a master chef. It crashed the medieval garden party, but brought enough nutritional gifts that everyone forgave the intrusion. Recent studies have revealed just how nutritious this weed truly is. Fat hen contains more protein than cabbage, more iron than spinach, and more calcium than kale. Had medieval nutritionists existed, they would have classified fat hen as a superfood. The name comes from its effectiveness as poultry feed. Chickens that eat fat hen produce more eggs and grow plumper. If medieval vegetables had marketing slogans, fat hens would be good enough for your chickens, even better for you. Archaeological digs have uncovered countless fat hen seeds in food waste pits, showing it was regularly eaten. During famines, this wild plant often meant the difference between starvation and survival. Cooking methods varied across Europe. The leaves were boiled like spinach or added to salads, while the seeds were ground into flour during hard times. Modern farming declared war on fat hen, considering it a competitor to crops. We essentially kicked a superfood out of our diet because it didn't fill out the proper application to be considered a vegetable. While fat hen struggled for recognition, another herb was fighting to maintain its culinary status. Why did a herb that could flavor everything just disappear from our kitchen gardens? Unlike fat hen, which never got proper recognition, lovage was a culinary superstar that mysteriously faded away. Roman soldiers carried lovage seeds as they conquered Europe, planting this powerful herb wherever they settled. Medieval monks continued the tradition, ensuring every monastery garden had a lovage plant. The flavor is intense. Imagine celery mixed with parsley, but multiplied by 10. Lovage is basically celery with superpowers. It's what celery would be if it started working out and got really serious about flavor. Medieval cooks used lovage extensively. One sprig could flavor an entire pot of soup. The dried leaves were sprinkled on the meat dishes. The seeds were crushed for bread. Even the roots were boiled and eaten like parsnips. Most impressively, the hollow stems were candied as sweet treats. What made lovage truly valuable in medieval times was its medicinal uses. The entire plant contains oils that aid digestion, reduce bloating, and act as a mild diuretic. Monastery records from the 13th century describe lovage tea as a remedy for troubles of the stomach and kidney complaints. A lovage plant can live for 20 years and grow over 6 feet tall, providing a tremendous amount of flavor from very little garden space. It's also incredibly hardy, surviving harsh winters and returning vigorously each spring. Medieval gardeners must have thought modern gardeners lost their minds. You're telling me you stopped growing a plant that flavors everything, lives for decades, and helps with digestion? Did you replace your brains with turnips? As international trade brought new spices to Europe, lovage gradually lost its prominence. While lovage faded away, another forgotten green faced its own challenges with a very confusing name. No, it has nothing to do with corn. This unfortunate naming confusion has plagued corn salad for centuries. While lovage suffered from being forgotten, corn salad suffered from being misunderstood. Corn salad gets its strange name from where it typically grows, in fields of grain, which Europeans called corn long before maize arrived from America. These small, tender greens pop up naturally in autumn after grain harvests and stay green through winter. It's like the quiet kid in class who gets overlooked because of a weird nickname but turns out to be the most interesting person there. Medieval farmers discovered these wild winter greens were not only edible, but delicious. Corn salad has a mild, slightly nutty flavor with none of the bitterness found in many wild greens. The leaves can be harvested throughout the coldest months when nothing else is growing. The nutritional profile would impress modern health experts. It contains 3 times more omega-3 fatty acids than iceberg lettuce and significant amounts of iron and vitamin C. Medieval people recognized its value as a fresh winter vegetable. Corn salad has to be the only vegetable that suffered from both an identity crisis and a public relations problem. It needed a medieval marketing team to clarify contains absolutely no corn. Modern agriculture favored lettuce varieties with longer shelf lives and easier harvesting. As corn salad faded from gardens, another bold-flavored medieval plant rejection for being simply too intense for modern tastes. Too intense for modern tastes? That's the story of tansy, a plant that medieval cooks couldn't live without, but modern people have almost completely abandoned. Tansy grows as a bushy perennial with fern-like leaves and bright yellow button flowers. Every part of the plant packs a powerful aromatic punch, a complex mix of bitter, spicy, and slightly sweet flavors that medieval taste buds craved. Modern chemical analysis has identified over 40 different flavor compounds in tansy leaves. If herbs were rock bands, tansy would be the one that plays so loud the neighbors call the police. Medieval cookbooks feature tansy in everything from savory dishes to desserts. The Easter specialty, tansy pudding, combined the chopped leaves with eggs, cream, breadcrumbs, and sugar, then fried the mixture into a cake. Tansy-flavored cheese was popular in spring celebrations, and even ale was infused with tansy for special occasions. Beyond its bold flavor, tansy served a practical purpose in medieval cuisine. Its powerful compounds work as a natural preservative, extending the shelf life of meats and baked goods. This was invaluable in an era without refrigeration. The plant also played a crucial role in medieval medicine. Tansy tea was used to treat intestinal worms, digestive issues, and fever. Monastery gardens always included tansy for both culinary and medicinal purposes, often planting it near doorways where its strong scent could repel flies and other insects. Modern chefs would probably describe tansy as aggressively aromatic, the medieval equivalent of using all caps in your seasoning. As milder herbs like parsley became more popular, tansy gradually lost its place in kitchens. While tansy fell out of favor for being too bold, another forgotten vegetable suffered the opposite fate. It grows wild. It requires zero maintenance, and yet we somehow forgot all about it. While tansy was too bold, sea kale was too easy to overlook. Growing along coastal areas of northern Europe, sea kale was a valuable food source for medieval communities. This hardy plant thrives in sandy, salty soil where few other edible plants can survive. Sea kale is like that friend who brings food to every gathering without being asked, yet somehow never gets invited to the cool parties. Medieval people harvested it two ways: blanched young shoots in spring, similar to asparagus, and matured leaves later, cooked like cabbage. Unlike many wild foods, sea kale is mild and sweet tasting. What made it especially valuable was its vitamin C content, 6 times higher than lemons by weight. For fishing communities with limited access to fresh produce, sea kale prevented scurvy. The disappearance of sea kale from our diet is like forgetting how to accept free money. It's literally sitting there on beaches, being delicious and nutritious while we ignore it. As sea kale faded into obscurity, another unusual plant was struggling with its dual identity. This one is truly weird. Woad was primarily grown for making blue dye, but medieval people also ate it. Unlike sea kale, which was purely for nutrition, woad lived a double life. The blue pigment from woad leaves colored everything from clothing to warrior paint. Before woad, trying to find blue clothing was like trying to find a quiet moment at a toddler's birthday party. Theoretically possible, but highly unlikely. What's strange is that young woad leaves are perfectly edible before they develop their dyeing compounds. Medieval farmers harvested these tender first leaves for spring salads and soups. The flavor is mild with a slight peppery kick, similar to young mustard greens. Growing woad was a smelly business. The process of extracting blue dye involved fermenting the leaves, creating such a terrible stench that royal decrees banned woad processing near important residences. It was the medieval equivalent of that one weird food that makes your whole kitchen smell for days. While woad struggled with its identity as both food and dye, another humble vegetable part was being overlooked. While woad struggled with its split personality, turnips suffered from people ignoring half their goodness. Everyone knows turnips, those humble root vegetables that fed countless medieval peasants. What most people don't realize is that medieval farmers valued the leafy green tops just as much as the roots below. It's like buying a smartphone and only using it to tell time. You're missing out on the best features. Turnip greens contain 4 times more calcium, 3 times more vitamin A, and twice the protein of the roots. Medieval peasants carefully harvested the outer leaves throughout the growing season without damaging the developing root. These greens were a staple in medieval soups, stews, and salads, adding their slightly peppery flavor to otherwise bland winter meals. Turnip greens deserve a comeback tour. They've been backstage too long while the roots get all the applause. From skirret to turnip greens, these forgotten vegetables show how much knowledge we've lost about food that once sustained our ancestors. Think your grocery bill is high? Medieval peasants had it worse. They had to stay alive on whatever they could find or grow. These 15 cheap meals weren't fancy, but they kept generations fed through plague, famine, and endless hard work. And at the top of that list, pottage. Ever had a house guest who just wouldn't leave? That's basically what pottage was to medieval peasants, except they actually wanted it to stick around. This legendary soup was the ultimate waste not, want not dish of the Middle Ages, simmering endlessly over the fire like the world's most patient dinner. Pottage wasn't just any soup, it was the soup, the cornerstone of medieval peasant nutrition and the original set it and forget it meal. Unlike our modern quick dinners that disappear after one sitting, pottage was a deliberate lifestyle, a practical solution to the harsh realities of medieval life. At its core, pottage was simply a thick, hearty stew that stayed alive for days or even weeks. The cooking pot rarely left the hearth, with new ingredients tossed in as others were eaten, the medieval version of a never-ending buffet, but with considerably fewer options and much less variety. What went into pottage? The better question is what didn't. The base typically consisted of whatever grain was cheapest and most available, barley, oats, or rye, boiled until it broke down into a thick porridge-like consistency. From there, peasants added whatever vegetables they could get their hands on: turnips, onions, leeks, cabbage, and if they were lucky, carrots or peas. One study of medieval food remains found that the average peasant household kept their pottage going for at least 4 days before starting fresh, though many families maintained their pot for much longer. During lean winter months, archaeological evidence from medieval village sites shows that pottage ingredients became increasingly limited, often reduced to just grains and root vegetables. While all social classes ate some version of pottage, there was a world of difference between peasant pottage and what bubbled in noble kitchens. Wealthy households enhanced their pottage with expensive imported spices, bits of meat, and even wine. Meanwhile, peasant pottage relied on local herbs for flavor: garlic, parsley, sage, or whatever grew nearby. On special occasions or after a successful hunt, a peasant family might drop a small piece of salt pork or bacon into their pottage pot. Not enough to make a meal of meat, but just enough to infuse the entire pot with flavor. The fat would rise to the top, providing precious calories during hard times. Some historians believe medieval peasants consumed as much as 2 to 3 pints of pottage daily, making it the true fuel of the feudal system. Not exactly a meal worth posting on social media, but it kept countless generations alive through centuries of hardship. Pottage may have been the never-ending soup of medieval times, but it wasn't the only thing that kept peasants on their feet. Bread connects us all. From ancient times to modern kitchens, it remains the world's most universal food. But the loaves that graced medieval peasant tables would make most of us today turn up our noses. Forget fluffy white bread or artisanal sourdough. Medieval peasant bread was dark, dense, and often as hard as the lives of those who ate it. Made primarily from rye or barley, grains that grew in poor soil where wheat struggled, these loaves bore little resemblance to what we call bread today. The grain for peasant bread wasn't just different. The entire process was. First, the grain was often of poor quality. The best wheat went to nobles and clergy who could afford it. Second, peasants paid hefty fees to have their grain ground at the lord's mill. To save on these costs, many would mix in fillers: ground peas, beans, acorns, chestnuts, and in desperate times, ground tree bark or straw. How much bread did the average peasant eat? The numbers are staggering. Records from medieval England show that a working man might consume 2 or 3 pounds of bread daily, providing over 60% of their total calories. Women and children ate proportionally similar amounts. This wasn't gluttony. Heavy labor in the fields required massive caloric intake, and bread delivered those calories cheaply. The baking process itself revealed the stark class divisions of medieval society. Wealthy households enjoyed fresh bread daily. Peasants, lacking private ovens, typically baked just once a week in communal village ovens or fashioned flat breads that could cook on simple hearthstones. These weekly loaves grew progressively harder and moldier as the days passed, requiring a dunk in pottage or ale to become edible again by week's end. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of medieval bread was the potential for poison. Rye, the peasant grain of choice in many regions, was susceptible to ergot fungus, a naturally occurring hallucinogen containing compounds similar to LSD. Entire villages sometimes experienced mass hallucinations, convulsions, and even death from what was called St. Anthony's fire. What they couldn't know was that their daily bread was to blame. Yet for all its dangers and deficiencies, bread was sacred in medieval culture. Stealing bread was punished severely, wasting it considered sinful. The medieval table began with bread and ended with bread. When famine struck, as it regularly did, families might survive for weeks on bread alone, though the definition of bread became increasingly creative. The dark, dense loaves that fueled medieval labor rarely came with accompaniments. But when peasants were lucky enough to have something to put on their bread, it was often something simple that required little preparation after a long day working the fields. In medieval cuisine, the answer was gruel, essentially one step above consuming boiled water with a spoon. When bread became scarce and pottage ingredients ran low, gruel stepped in as the final defense against an empty stomach. "Please, sir, I want some more," might be the famous literary line associated with gruel, but medieval peasants rarely had the luxury of seconds. Gruel was survival food, plain and simple. Made by boiling a small amount of grain in a large amount of water, it stretched minimal ingredients to their absolute limit. The recipe, if you could call it that, couldn't be simpler. Take oats, barley, or whatever grain scraps remained in the bottom of the storage bin, add water until the mixture looked desperately thin, then cook until it resembled something edible. If you were particularly fortunate, you might have a pinch of salt to add. The result? A watery, bland substance that filled the belly without satisfying any other human desire. Gruel differed from pottage in its deliberate thinness and from porridge in its sad lack of substance. Medieval records indicate that during the harshest famines, monasteries feeding the poor would stretch a single cup of oats into gruel that served 10 people. The mathematician in the room might observe that this works out to less than 2 tablespoons of grain per person, hardly a meal by any standard. Interestingly, gruel wasn't just for the desperately poor. Monks across medieval Europe regularly consumed gruel as part of their religious practice. Monastery kitchen records from the 12th century show that monks ate gruel during fasting periods, with one abbey documenting consumption of gruel twice daily during Lent. Their bowls might occasionally include honey or dried fruit, luxuries ordinary peasants could only dream about. For the sick and elderly, gruel became medieval health care. Those too ill to chew bread or too weak to digest heartier foods were fed gruel until they recovered. Or didn't. Medieval medical texts recommend gruel for ailments ranging from fever to toothache, suggesting additions like herbs or wine for medicinal purposes. Of course, peasants rarely had access to such fancy versions. Children weaning from breast milk often transitioned directly to gruel, creating generations of Europeans who never knew the concept of baby food. Court records from medieval England occasionally mention children who died of malnutrition despite being fed gruel regularly, a grim reminder of its nutritional inadequacy. The taste? About what you'd expect. Contemporary accounts describe it as thin, watery, and occasionally slimy, hardly a ringing endorsement. One medieval writer noted that even the dogs turn from it unless truly starving, which tells you everything you need to know. When even gruel became too luxurious due to grain shortages, medieval peasants turned to another reliable crop that thrived in poor soil and stored through winter. Turnips, the forgotten vegetable of modern cuisine, once reigned supreme in medieval kitchens. While today's shoppers might pass them by without a second glance, these humble roots kept countless peasants alive through centuries of hardship. What made turnips so essential to medieval survival? First, they grew almost anywhere. Poor soil, turnips thrived. Short growing season, turnips managed. Little attention from busy farmers, turnips forgave the neglect. A single turnip seed could yield up to 15 pounds of food, making them among the most efficient crops a peasant could plant. Turnip stew became the medieval equivalent of fast food, quick, filling, and available year-round. The basic recipe required minimal effort. Chop turnips, add water, boil until soft, season with salt if available. That's it. No fancy techniques, no rare ingredients, just pure sustenance. Storage was another turnip superpower. Long before refrigeration, medieval peasants stored turnips in cool, dry cellars where they remained edible for months. Some villages dug specialized turnip pits, essentially underground storage chambers lined with straw, where turnips kept fresh from harvest until late spring. Records from one English manor in 1286 noted that turnips stored this way fed village families for 7 months after harvest. Unlike many vegetables, the entire turnip was edible. Roots went into stews, leaves were added to pottage, and even the flowers could be eaten in spring. Nothing went to waste. Medieval field records suggest that a family of 4 needed to grow about 200 pounds of turnips to survive winter, a goal achievable in a surprisingly small garden plot. The humble turnip even played a role in medieval medicine. Folk healers prescribed turnip juice for coughs and turnip poultices for skin ailments. One monastery medical text claims turnips drive away winter melancholy, perhaps an early recognition of the nutritional benefits of fresh vegetables during vitamin-scarce winter months. Of course, eating turnips day after day had its downsides. Medieval writers occasionally complained about the sameness of peasant meals, with one noting that the poor eat turnips until their skin takes on the pallor of the root itself. Another drawback was less aesthetic and more aromatic. Turnips, especially when reheated repeatedly, developed a distinctive smell that permeated medieval homes. For all their benefits, turnips weren't exactly celebration food. When asked what feast he would prepare if suddenly wealthy, a medieval peasant reportedly answered, "The same turnips, but with meat." This humble aspiration speaks volumes about medieval culinary reality. While turnips may have dominated the medieval table, they rarely appeared alone. Another vegetable duo frequently joined them, creating a trio of flavors that, while simple, offered both nutrition and a welcome break from turnip monotony. Could 2 vegetables clear a medieval peasant hut faster than the plague? Cabbage and onions certainly tried their best. This odorous duo formed the backbone of peasant cooking across Europe. adding much-needed flavor to otherwise bland meals while simultaneously testing the limits of medieval ventilation. Cabbage earned its spot in peasant gardens by being super useful. A single cabbage plant could grow very big, with heads weighing up to 15 pounds. Old farm records showed that 10 cabbage plants could feed a family for months, taking up very little garden space. The outer leaves could be picked throughout the growing season, while the middle kept growing, like food that replaced itself as you ate it. Saving cabbage made it truly valuable. Fresh cabbage lasted weeks in cool storage, but soured cabbage, what we now call sauerkraut, kept for months. Diggers found old cabbage pits in medieval villages where people let cabbage sour. One dug-up pit from a 1300s village had leftover bits from over 100 cabbages saved together, enough to feed several families all winter. Onions worked perfectly with cabbage in old-time cooking. Tough and hard to kill, they grew in the worst dirt and stored without any special tools. Old garden books told people to plant onions around other crops to keep bugs away, making them twice as useful in small peasant gardens where every bit of space mattered. Together, these veggies turned plain food into something with real taste. Boiled together, they made a simple side dish. Added to soup, they gave more flavor. Mixed with tiny bits of meat, they became a feast. Old tax records sometimes list cabbage and onions as okay payment for small debts, showing how much people valued them every day. The belly troubles from these veggies were well known back then. Old court records from many villages talk about problems caused by the too much gas after cabbage meals. One rule in a monastery banned cabbage on days when monks had important visitors, hinting that the farts afterward weren't good for polite company. Oddly enough, old-time doctors didn't trust veggies. Rich people's doctors often warned nobles not to eat poor people plants like cabbage, saying they made you sad and slow thinking. Meanwhile, the poor folks eating these veggies every day lived on much less food than the rich, and probably had fewer of the food-related illnesses that rich people often got. For all their benefits, cabbage and onions couldn't supply everything a hard-working peasant needed. A diet with only these vegetables, even with bread and pottage, didn't have enough protein. Medieval peasants knew this by instinct, if not by science, which led them to seek protein wherever they could find it. Medieval folks didn't have protein shakes, but they did have mushy peas and beans. These humble crops were the everyday heroes of the peasant diet, providing the strength needed for long days of hard work in the fields. Peas and beans offered what bread and cabbage couldn't: real protein. Dried peas contained about 25% protein by weight, making them worth their weight in gold during winter months when meat was scarce or gone completely. A small patch of peas could yield up to 60 pounds of dried peas, enough to help a family through the leanest months. Growing these protein-packed foods was simple enough, even for the worst farmers. Peas and beans fixed nitrogen in the soil, which meant they could grow in fields where other crops had used up all the good stuff. Smart peasants planted peas and beans between rows of other veggies, or after harvesting grain, getting extra food from the same patch of land. The most common way to eat peas and beans was mashed. After soaking dried peas or beans overnight, peasants boiled them until soft, then mashed them into a thick paste. Salt was added if available, and maybe wild herbs if they were lucky. The result looked a bit like baby food, but packed a nutritional punch that kept workers going through 12-hour workdays. During the harshest times, pea and bean mash became the main meal rather than a side dish. Old records from one English village during the famine of 1315 note that families survived for weeks on nothing but pea mash and small beer, with bread becoming a luxury. Monks across Europe relied heavily on these humble foods. Church rules banned meat on many days of the year, sometimes more than half the calendar, making peas and beans vital to monastery kitchens. Count books from a large abbey show they stocked over 3,000 pounds of dried peas yearly for just 40 monks. That's 75 pounds per monk. Storage was another big plus. While fresh peas and beans lasted only days, the dried versions kept for years if stored right. Peasant homes often had clay pots or wooden barrels of dried legumes tucked away as insurance against bad harvests. One dig at a peasant home found peas still in storage pots from 10 years earlier. Still edible, if not exactly tasty. The downside? Same as cabbage, these foods cause gas. Medieval health guides warned against eating too many beans before church services or court appearances. One old joke told of a bean farmer who couldn't sell his crop because he'd tested too much of his product on the way to market. While peas and beans kept peasants alive and healthy enough to work, they weren't exactly exciting to eat day after day. Medieval peasants still craved variety in their meals. Whenever they had the chance to add something different to their cooking pots, they jumped at the opportunity. And sometimes that opportunity came from surprising sources. Eat what you can get. This was the golden rule of medieval meat eating for the poor. While nobles dined on roasted venison and fat capons, peasants made do with the bits nobody else wanted: the organs, feet, heads, and odd scraps that today we call offal. Animal butchering in medieval times followed strict rules about who got what parts. The lord of the manor claimed the best cuts: the tenderloins, plump breasts, and meaty haunches. Town folks with money bought the decent middle-grade pieces. What remained for peasants? Everything else. But medieval peasants were masters at turning these scraps into food worth eating. Take the humble pig head. After a pig slaughter, peasant families often received the head as partial payment for their work. Nothing went unused. The cheeks provided small but tender meat portions. The ears were cleaned, sliced, and fried crisp. The snout and lips went into jellied dishes. Even the brain was scooped out and scrambled like eggs. Larger animals provided even more offal options. Cow stomachs, cleaned and boiled, became the container for haggis-like mixtures of grain and bits of heart or liver. Sheep lungs, sliced thin and fried with onions, offered a quick meal after butchering day. Blood from any animal became blood pudding when mixed with grain and cooked in a cleaned intestine casing. Game animals too small for the lord's table often ended up in peasant cooking pots whole. Squirrels, hedgehogs, and even rats in desperate times provided tiny portions of meat that flavored otherwise plain vegetable dishes. Records from one medieval village during a harsh winter mention peasants trapping and eating badgers, foxes, and other animals typically considered inedible. The unwritten rule was simple: if it couldn't kill you, it was food. This waste-nothing approach stretched tiny amounts of animal protein to feed many mouths. A single cow's organs could provide meals for several families, while the prime cuts fed just one noble household for a day or two. Court records reveal how valuable these scraps were. Theft of offal was punished severely, sometimes with the same penalties as stealing more valuable cuts. One medieval English town recorded finding a man for stealing a sheep's pluck, the heart, liver, and lungs, equal to 2 weeks' wages. Preservation techniques for offal were necessarily quick. Without refrigeration, organs spoiled rapidly. Smoking, salting, and immediate cooking were the only options. Many offal dishes became linked to butchering days, eaten within hours of the animal's slaughter in an almost ceremonial feast. For people living near coasts or rivers, another source of protein swam within reach. Medieval folks didn't have drive-thrus, but they did have salted herring, the original grab-and-go meal. These preserved fish were the fast food of the Middle Ages, ready to eat without cooking and packed with enough salt to make you thirsty for days. Herring became the fish of choice for medieval peasants for 3 simple reasons. They swam in huge groups, were easy to catch, and could be preserved with simple salt. Fishing records from medieval times show just how massive the herring industry was. During peak season, a single fishing fleet from Great Yarmouth in England could haul in more than 40 million herring in just a few weeks. That's enough fish to give every person in medieval England 7 fish each. The salt preservation process was quick but smelly work. Fresh herring spoiled within a day, so fishing boats often carried salt on board. Workers gutted the fish, packed them in heavy salt, and stored them in wooden barrels right on the deck. The smell was so strong that herring processing areas of medieval towns had their own districts, safely downwind from where most people lived. For peasants, salted herring became the answer to many food problems. First, it solved the meat ban during religious fasting days. The church banned meat on Fridays during Lent and on many other holy days, sometimes totaling more than half the year. Fish remained allowed, making herring a crucial protein source for those times. Second, herring could travel far from the coast without spoiling. Packed in barrels, these fish reached deep inland where fresh fish never could. Trade records show barrels of herring moving hundreds of miles from the sea, reaching mountain villages and remote farms. Third, no cooking needed. While fresh herring required cooking, the heavily salted version could be eaten as is, a medieval version of ready-to-eat food. For busy peasants working from dawn to dusk, a quick meal of herring and bread saved precious time and fuel. The cheapest herring came white, simply gutted and salted. Those with a bit more money might buy red herring, which were salted and then smoked for days until they turned a reddish-brown color and lasted even longer. The smoking process made them less salty and gave them a stronger flavor that some preferred. Just how many herring did medieval Europeans eat? Tax records tell an amazing story. The small Baltic island of Scania processed more than 300 million herring annually in peak years. A single monastery in York bought 15,000 herring yearly to feed just 30 monks. That's 500 fish per monk per year, or more than one herring every single day. Of course, eating fish day after day got boring fast. Medieval cooks found ways to make herring more interesting, chopping them into spreads, adding them to pies, or soaking them to remove salt before cooking. But no matter how they prepared it, herring breath remained an occupational hazard of being medieval. After a salty meal, medieval peasants needed something to wash it down with, and their drink of choice wasn't water. Water in medieval times could be deadly. Wells were often dug too close to outhouses, rivers caught sewage from upstream towns, and most people had no idea that dirty water could make you sick. They just knew that people who drank from certain water sources often fell ill, while those who stuck to ale stayed healthy. The brewing process accidentally solved this problem. Boiling the water for brewing killed harmful germs, and the alcohol helped prevent new ones from growing. Medieval people didn't understand the science, but they saw the results clearly enough. Ale drinkers were healthier than water drinkers. Ale in medieval times wasn't the strong stuff we think of today. Small ale or small beer contained just enough alcohol to preserve it, about 1 to 3%, similar to modern light beer. This weak brew was an everyday drink for everyone, including children. Yes, medieval kids drank ale with breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but they weren't stumbling around drunk. It was more like drinking very flavorful water. How much ale did the average person drink? Medieval records tell an amazing story. Many adult workers received ale allowances of a gallon per day. That's 8 pints. Manor records show that during harvest time, when work was hardest, this might increase to a gallon and a half. No wonder medieval workers took so many breaks during the day. They had a lot of liquid to process. Brewing was usually women's work, done right at home. The basic recipe was simple. Heat water, add malted grain, strain out the grain, add flavor with herbs, then let it ferment. Most women brewed once or twice a week, making the family supply in wooden tubs before storing it in pottery jugs or wooden barrels. Ale spoiled quickly without refrigeration, usually within a week. This meant it was truly a local food, made and consumed within the same community. It also meant brewing was a constant chore for medieval households, as necessary and regular as making bread. Speaking of bread, ale and bread were intimate partners in medieval kitchens. Both needed grain, both used yeast for fermentation, and many households made them together on brewing day. Leftover ale could be used in bread dough, while bits of bread could start the fermentation for the next ale batch. Nothing went to waste. Ale even served as payment. Medieval work records show that many tasks were rewarded with both money and ale. Building a section of village wall might earn you 3 pence plus 2 gallons of ale. Church bell ringers often received payment in ale rather than coins. One English village paid its rat catcher with a weekly jug, perhaps to help him forget what he did all day. For special occasions and celebrations, peasants might enjoy stronger drinks with more flavor and kick. The contrast between medieval peasants sipping cider and today's folks buying expensive drinks couldn't be more striking. While cider and mead were treats for the poor, they weren't luxury items but practical solutions to food storage problems and rare sources of sweetness in an otherwise bland diet. Cider became the drink of choice in areas where apples grew well. Apple trees had major advantages for peasant farmers. Once planted, they produced fruit for decades with minimal care. Even better, they could grow on hillsides too steep for regular crops, making use of otherwise wasted land. In parts of England, France, and Spain, almost every peasant household had rights to at least a few apple trees. Making cider involved simple tools and basic steps. Peasants collected apples, crushed them in wooden presses, collected the juice, and left it to ferment naturally. The wild yeasts on apple skins started fermentation without any extra help. After a few weeks, the sweet juice transformed into a mildly alcoholic drink that could keep for months, much longer than the apples themselves would have lasted. Strong cider contained about 4 to 8% alcohol, enough to feel good after a few cups, but not so strong that workers couldn't function the next day. Weaker versions were everyday drinks, while the stronger batches were saved for special occasions like weddings and harvest festivals. Mead offered an even sweeter escape from daily troubles. Made by fermenting honey with water, mead was the oldest known alcoholic drink in Europe. However, honey was expensive and hard to get, making mead much rarer than ale or cider for average peasants. Most peasants only tasted mead a few times a year, usually at Christmas, Easter, or when celebrating weddings. Some clever peasants kept their own beehives, providing honey for both sweetening food and making small batches of mead. A single hive could produce 15 to 20 pounds of honey yearly, enough for a family to make a few gallons of mead and still have honey for other uses. Both cider and mead served important practical purposes beyond just tasting good. The alcohol helped preserve the natural sugars in apples and honey far longer than they would have lasted otherwise. In an age without refrigeration, turning sweet things into alcohol was a smart storage solution. Medieval kitchen records showed that cider could last 6 months to a year if stored in cool cellars, while properly made mead could last several years. These sweet drinks also provided valuable calories during hard times. When bread supplies ran low, a cup of cider or mead delivered quick energy. Records from one English village during a food shortage mention adults drinking cider as a meal replacement when grain supplies dwindled. Speaking of sweetness, while honey made mead possible, it also served many other purposes in medieval kitchens, joining forces with other rare sweet treats. Sugar wasn't something most medieval peasants ever tasted. This expensive import remained firmly in the realm of the wealthy, who used it both as food and medicine. For the common folk, sweetness came directly from nature in the form of honey and wild berries, treats that brightened an otherwise dull diet. Honey stood as the king of sweeteners in the medieval world. Unlike sugar, it could be produced locally, though not without risk and effort. Brave peasants gathered wild honey by following bees to their hives, smoking them to reduce stinging, and cutting out honeycomb chunks. This dangerous work often resulted in multiple stings, but yielded liquid gold that made the pain worthwhile. Some clever peasants took beekeeping a step further. Old farming guides describe simple beehives made from hollow logs, straw skeps, or clay pots placed in sunny spots near flowering plants. A well-managed hive could produce 15 to 20 pounds of honey yearly, an incredible luxury for a peasant family. Village records sometimes list beehives as valuable enough to include in wills and marriage contracts alongside land and livestock. Honey did much more than sweeten food. Medieval medical guides recommended it for healing wounds, soothing coughs, and preserving other medicines. As a practical tool, honey's stickiness made it useful for setting hairstyles and even removing unwanted body hair when mixed with other ingredients. These multiple uses made honey all the more precious to those lucky enough to have access to it. When a tiny bit of honey was available, peasants used it with incredible care, adding just a drop to morning porridge, spreading the thinnest layer on bread, or using it to make a special treat for a sick family member. Court records from one medieval English village mention a woman accused of stealing a honey pot. Her punishment was nearly as severe as if she'd stolen a cow, showing how valuable this sweetener was. Wild berries provided seasonal bursts of sweetness that required only the labor of gathering. Strawberries, blackberries, blueberries, and raspberries grew wild in forests and field edges, free for anyone with time to pick them. Unlike honey, berries couldn't be preserved easily without sugar, so they remained strictly seasonal treats. Berry picking became a community activity, with children often sent out in groups to gather these precious fruits. Medieval feast records reveal how special these sweet foods were. When a lord wanted to impress guests, dishes featuring honey and berries often appeared at the end of meals. For peasants invited to these rare feasts, tasting honey-sweetened berry desserts might be a once-in-a-lifetime experience. One old joke told of a peasant who, when asked what he'd do if he were king for a day, replied he would eat berries with honey until my belly ached. A simple dream that shows how rare this combination was for ordinary people. When berries and honey weren't available, medieval peasants sometimes found other starchy foods to fill their hungry bellies. Maybe squirrels were onto something after all. Medieval peasants often turned to the forest floor for food, gathering nuts that modern folks might walk right past. Acorns and chestnuts became crucial backup foods when grain supplies ran low, turning forests into emergency pantries. Chestnuts were the easier of the two to use. Unlike acorns, chestnuts taste sweet naturally and don't require extensive processing. In areas with chestnut forests, especially parts of France, Italy, and Spain, chestnuts became known as the bread tree because they provided starchy nutrition similar to grain. A good chestnut harvest could save a village from winter hunger. How important were chestnuts? Tax records from some medieval villages assessed a household's wealth partly by how many chestnut trees they had access to. In parts of France, chestnuts made up nearly 20% of the peasant diet during winter months. One large chestnut tree could produce up to 200 pounds of nuts in a good year, enough to keep a family alive for weeks if grain ran short. Medieval peasants prepared chestnuts in several ways. Roasting was the simplest. Just toss them in hot ashes until the shells cracked open. Boiling removed more of the tannic acid and made them easier to digest. For long-term storage, chestnuts were often dried and ground into flour that could be mixed with grain flour to stretch bread supplies. This chestnut flour didn't rise as well as wheat flour, but it filled empty stomachs just the same. Acorns required much more work, but could save lives during famine. The bitter tannins in raw acorns make them inedible without processing. Medieval peasants developed methods to remove these bitter compounds, usually by repeatedly soaking crushed acorns in water. The process took days and used lots of water, but the resulting acorn meal could be mixed with grain flour to make barely palatable emergency bread. During the great famines that struck Europe every few decades, these tree nuts became true lifesavers. Court records from the famine of 1315 to 1317 mention people fighting over access to nut-gathering grounds, showing just how valuable these forest foods became when other options disappeared. Even in normal times, clever peasants gathered and stored nuts as insurance against poor harvests. Dried properly, both acorns and chestnuts could last for years. One medieval farming manual recommends storing chestnuts in sand to prevent mold and keep them fresh longer. The forest provided these staples, but it offered much more to those who knew where to look. Some medieval villages had strict rules about who could gather which forest foods and when, showing just how important these wild resources were to everyday survival. When truly desperate times came, peasants turned to an even wider range of hunted foods from fields and forests. Medieval wild food gathering followed the changing seasons, with each month offering different options. Spring brought tender young greens like dandelions, nettles, and sorrel that appeared when food stores were often at their lowest. Young nettles, despite their sting, were among the most valuable spring finds, packed with vitamins and minerals after the long winter diet of grain and preserved foods. Peasants used thick gloves or special picking techniques to harvest them without getting stung, then boiled them to remove the sting. Summer expanded the wild menu dramatically. Meadows and woods filled with edible mushrooms, though picking them required careful knowledge. One medieval village record mentions a family that died after eating poisonous mushrooms during a food shortage, a grim reminder of the risks. Safer options included wild garlic, chickweed, and lamb's quarters, all of which could be added to pottage to stretch meager supplies. Wild onion relatives grew abundantly in many regions. Records show that during the famine years of 1310 to 1322, many communities survived partly on wild leeks and ramps dug from forest floors. These strong flavored plants provided both nutrition and flavor when little else was available. Fall brought nuts, as we've seen, but also rose hips, hawthorn berries, and crab apples, all rich in vitamin C and natural preservatives. These tart fruits rarely made tasty eating on their own, but could be stored for winter medicine and flavoring. Medieval cookbooks sometimes mention these wild fruits as additions to more palatable foods. The gathering skills of peasant women earned special recognition in medieval documents. Manor court records occasionally mention women known as particularly skilled finders of foods, who could locate edible mushrooms, identify useful plants, and knew where the best wild fruit grew. These women sometimes received payment for teaching others or leading gathering groups during hard times. Just how important were these wild foods? Studies of medieval diets suggest that in normal years, gathered plants might make up 5 to 10% of peasant nutrition. During famines, this could jump to 30% or more. One account from the Great Famine tells of villages surviving almost entirely on gathered greens and tree bark for weeks. Medieval law recognized the importance of these foods, too. Many forests and woodlands had specific gleaning rights that allowed peasants to collect wild foods even on lands they didn't own. Legal disputes over these rights appear repeatedly in court records, showing their crucial importance to survival. When even wild plants became scarce, desperate times called for desperate measures. Some medieval peasants turned to making bread from unusual ingredients, using methods that would make even the toughest stomach turn. Ash cakes represented the last line of defense against starvation, a type of primitive bread that could be made with minimal ingredients and zero kitchen tools. The concept was brutally simple. Take whatever ground meal you had, mix it with water to form a thick paste, flatten it into a patty, and cook it directly in the hot ashes of a fire. No oven, no baking stone, not even a pot needed. Just fire, ash, and desperation. During normal times, ash cakes rarely appeared on medieval tables. They were considered emergency food, the kind made only when proper bread wasn't possible. But during the frequent famines that struck medieval Europe, these humble cakes kept countless people alive. What made ash cakes so important was their flexibility. When wheat and rye ran out, any ground grain would work: barley, oats, millet, or even pea flour. When all grain was gone, creative substitutes took their place: ground acorns, dried and ground tree bark, crushed roots, or even ground hay. Records from the famine of 1315 to 1317 describe desperate peasants making ash cakes from dust swept from the floor of the granary, literally the dirt and leftover grain bits from empty storehouses. The cooking method itself dated back to ancient times. Without ovens in their homes, many peasants already cooked flatbreads on heated stones. Ash cakes took this idea one step further, eliminating even the need for the stone. Medieval writings describe how to brush the worst of the ashes off before eating, though gritty teeth were still an occupational hazard of eating this survival food. One surprising advantage of ash cakes was their quick cooking time. Traditional bread required hours of rising, kneading, and baking. Ash cakes could be ready in minutes, a crucial benefit when hunger gnawed and energy for cooking was limited. Medieval work songs sometimes mention ash cakes as field food, made quickly during brief breaks from labor when workers couldn't return home for meals. The taste? About what you'd expect from bread baked in ashes. Smoky, often bitter, and frequently mixed with actual ash, these cakes weren't winning any medieval baking contests. One old joke claimed that ash cakes are the only food that tastes better if you drop them in the mud first, the mud presumably covering the ashy flavor. Despite their unpleasant taste, ash cakes provided the calories needed to survive. During the worst recorded medieval famine, an estimated 15% of Europe's population died of starvation or related illness. Those who survived often did so by eating foods like ash cakes that would normally be considered inedible. A 16th century farming manual includes a grim but practical piece of advice. When grain fails and bread cannot be made in the usual way, the wise peasant remembers the ways of cooking in ash, for it has saved our people since time beyond memory. In the harshest times, even ash cakes might not be possible if ingredients ran too low. That's when medieval peasants turned to true improvisation. The best medieval dish wasn't actually a dish at all. It was simply whatever bits and pieces happened to be around, thrown together in a pot and called dinner. Medieval peasants were masters of kitchen improv, centuries before it became trendy to clean out your fridge and make a meal from the random leftovers. This whatever we have approach wasn't just common, it was daily life for most families. Old records from manor kitchens show carefully planned meals with specific ingredients, but peasant cooking rarely followed recipes. Instead, it followed a simple rule: use what's available, waste nothing, and make it filling enough to work another day. What might a typical whatever we have meal look like? In spring, it could be a handful of wild greens tossed with the last winter turnips and a few dried peas. Summer might bring a mix of garden vegetables with a tiny bit of bacon fat for flavor. Fall could mean mushrooms and nuts added to cabbage. Winter often meant scraping by with whatever preserved foods remained in storage. The cooking method was equally flexible. Got a fire going all day? Throw everything in a pot and make soup. Need to work in the fields until dark? Leave ingredients simmering all day in a covered pot buried in hot ashes. No time to cook at all? Cold leftovers mixed with a chunk of bread would do. This flexible eating style developed out of necessity. Unlike modern times, where most people eat 3 separate meals daily, medieval peasants often ate just once or twice. Records from farming communities show that during busy seasons like harvest, workers might eat a small morning meal, Then, a single large meal after the day's work ended. This pattern made the whatever we have approach even more practical. One cooking session using whatever was available. The mixing of odd ingredients sometimes created surprisingly good results. Several dishes that later became regional specialties started as peasant whatever we have meals. The Italian ribollita began as reheated leftover bread and vegetables. French ratatouille originated as a summer clean-out-the-garden dish. Many stews, casseroles, and one-pot meals across Europe began as peasant improvisation rather than planned recipes. Medieval tax records give us hints about these mixed meals. When paying taxes in food, peasants often delivered oddly specific combinations: 3 turnips, half a cabbage, and a handful of dried peas, for example. These random groupings likely represented whatever was actually available that day, not planned combinations. During holidays and celebrations, even the whatever we have meals got an upgrade. Saved bits of special ingredients might appear: a precious pinch of salt, a rare spice traded from a passing merchant, or the first fresh vegetables of spring. These small luxuries transformed ordinary mixed meals into feasts by peasant standards. A medieval French saying claimed that the best sauce is hunger, meaning that any food tastes good when you're truly hungry. Peasants living through the hardships of medieval life understood this better than anyone. Their creative approach to cooking with limited resources wasn't just about survival, it was the original farm-to-table cuisine, shaped by seasons, necessity, and remarkable human adaptability. Back in the day, medieval farmers grew all kinds of weird and wonderful fruits, ones you've probably never heard of because modern farming just forgot about them. It's time to bring back these 15 lost medieval fruits. And trust me, they deserve a second chance. Let's kick things off with the medlar, a forgotten fruit with possibly the most unfortunate nickname in food history: open arse. I'm not making this up. Medieval people really called it that because of how it looks. This strange little fruit was a winter superstar when medieval farmers had basically nothing else growing. Imagine walking through snow to pick something that looks like a small brown apple crossed with a rosehip. Here's the weird part. You can't eat medlars when they're freshly picked. They need to be bledded first, which is a fancy way of saying let them rot a bit. You harvest them after the first frost, then leave them in a cool place until they turn soft and brown, looking pretty much exactly like overripe fruit you'd normally throw away. The taste? Absolutely worth the wait. It's like apple butter mixed with dates, cinnamon, and wine all wrapped up in one bite. Medieval people went crazy for them. Even Shakespeare and Chaucer couldn't stop writing about medlars, though usually making those obvious jokes about the fruit's appearance. If food hipsters discovered medlars today, they'd be charging $15 for medlar jam on artisanal toast. And honestly, it might be worth it. While medlars were the winter champions of medieval fruit, they weren't the only forgotten treasures that kept farmers fed throughout the changing seasons. The sorb apple might have apple in its name, but this medieval fruit is actually more related to the mountain ash tree. Truth in advertising wasn't exactly a medieval priority. These are the same people who called whale sea beef on Fridays to avoid religious meat restrictions. Medieval farmers didn't care about botanical technicalities, though. They cared about flavor, and sorb apples delivered big time. What made sorb apples special? They were the secret weapon in medieval cider making. When added to regular apples during fermentation, sorb apples gave drinks an extra kick and depth that modern ciders can only dream about. The small, firm fruits contain natural tannins and unique sugars that created complex flavors without any fancy equipment. The Romans first documented sorb apples, but medieval farmers took them to the next level. In parts of England and France, certain villages became famous specifically for their sorb-infused ciders. Some medieval tax records actually show farmers paying their lords with jugs of this special cider instead of coins. Sorry I can't pay my taxes this year, but have you tried this amazing drink? Is apparently an excuse that actually worked in medieval times. Medieval drinking games probably went something like, take a sip every time the plague comes to town. But at least they had great cider while waiting it out. The sorb apple nearly vanished after the 1700s when newer apple varieties took over. Today, only a handful of traditional orchards still grow these forgotten fruits, mostly in remote parts of Europe where old ways die hard. While the sorb apple gave drinks their kick, another medieval fruit was so valuable it became a form of actual currency in local markets. The humble service tree looks unremarkable today, but during medieval times, these trees were treated like living banks. People protected these trees better than modern banks guard their vaults, and with good reason. A single mature tree could feed a family for months. What made these fruits worth their weight in gold? Patience and preservation. Service trees take up to 30 years before they produce their first harvest, practically forever in medieval terms, when people rarely lived past 40. Once the trees finally produced fruit, the reward was incredible. Small brown pear-shaped fruits that could last for months without rotting in an era with no refrigeration. The fruits start out hard as rocks and inedible. After harvesting, they were stored in straw until they softened and developed a taste similar to dates mixed with baked apples. This long-lasting quality made service fruits extremely valuable through winter when food became scarce. Service trees were such prized possessions that they appeared in family wills and property deeds. Medieval court records show actual disputes over who owned specific trees, with judges sometimes splitting the yearly harvest between feuding families. While service trees provided lasting winter fruit, medieval monks preferred another forgotten fruit. Monastery gardens across medieval Europe grew cornelian cherry trees not for their beauty, but for their bright red fruits that could save lives. Despite its name and appearance, the cornelian cherry isn't related to regular cherries at all. It's actually from the dogwood family. These small, ruby-colored fruits ripened in late summer when many other fruits were already gone. Medieval monks became experts at using them for medicine, treating everything from stomach problems to fevers. The fruits are packed with vitamin C, which help fight off the common cold and scurvy long before anyone understood what vitamins were. Medieval medicine had some truly terrible ideas, like drilling holes in people's heads to release evil spirits, but using cornelian cherries was one of their rare good calls. The tart taste made cornelian cherries perfect for preserves and syrups that could be stored year-round in the monastery infirmaries. Records from the 9th century show that Charlemagne himself ordered these trees planted throughout his empire specifically for their health benefits. What made these fruits special was their versatility. Beyond medicine, the extremely hard wood from cornelian cherry trees was used to make tools, weapons, and even parts for medieval crossbows. A single tree provided both healing fruits and wood strong enough to make weapons. Talk about medieval multitasking. While monks treasured cornelian cherries for healing the sick, another forgotten fruit faced quite the opposite reputation. Barberry bushes with their bright red berries once filled medieval gardens before becoming the target of history's strangest plant ban. These tart little fruits were outlawed because people believed they caused wheat rust, a fungal disease that ruined grain crops. The medieval logic was flawless. This plant grows near our fields. Our wheat is sick. Clearly, the plant is a witch. Case closed. The irony? Barberry actually does host wheat rust. Medieval farmers were basically agricultural detectives without the cool hats and magnifying glasses. They figured this out centuries before modern science confirmed it. Before the bans, barberry was a kitchen superstar. The sour berries added punch to medieval sauces, particularly for game meats. Cooks used them much like we use cranberries today, to cut through rich, fatty foods with bright acidity. Medieval recipe books might as well have read, Step 1, kill something with a bow. Step 2, add barberries. Step 3, serve to the Lord who hasn't brushed his teeth in decades. Many villages kept 1 or 2 barberry bushes safely away from wheat fields, treating them like valuable but dangerous treasures. The fruits were worth the risk for their medicinal properties. They contain berberine, a compound that really does fight infections. While barberry struggled under its unfair reputation, another forgotten fruit was valued precisely because it appeared when none were expected. The first taste of sweetness after a long winter came from nespoli, or loquats as we call them today. These golden fruits arrived when medieval pantries were at their emptiest, making them worth their weight in actual gold. What makes nespoli truly special? They ripened when every other fruit tree was just starting to flower. Their unusual growing cycle meant they bloomed in autumn, survived winter as tiny green fruits, and ripened in early spring when food was most scarce. Medieval calendar makers should have marked the seasons as winter, still winter, nespoli time, and finally summer. The taste was unlike anything else available in medieval Europe. a unique mix of peach, mango, and citrus flavors, all from a fruit that grew in cold climates. For people used to bland winter foods, biting into a ripe loquat must have felt like pure magic. Nespoli trees originally came from China, but spread across the Mediterranean by the 10th century. Monasteries and castle gardens prized these trees not only for their early fruits, but also for their medicinal leaves, which were brewed into teas for cough and lung problems. The trees themselves became status symbols. A lord or lady with Nespoli trees showed they could afford exotic imports and had the skilled gardeners needed to keep them alive through harsh winters. Having a Nespoli tree in medieval times was like having the only ice cream shop open in winter. Suddenly, everyone wanted to be your friend. While Nespoli brightened early spring, another forgotten fruit had traveled even further to reach medieval tables. From the dusty markets of ancient China to the tables of medieval Europe, jujubes traveled farther than most medieval people ever did. These small fruits, somewhere between dates and apples in taste, were tough enough to survive trade routes spanning thousands of miles. Medieval gardeners loved jujubes because they were basically the zombie plants of the fruit world. Nothing could kill them. The Black Death wiped out half of Europe, but couldn't touch these stubborn little fruits. Fresh jujubes were eaten like apples, starting crisp but developing a chewy, date-like texture as they dried naturally on the tree. This self-preserving quality made them valuable as travel food for knights and pilgrims making long journeys. Medieval travel food options were basically dried meat that could break teeth, bread that could break teeth, or jujubes, which at least wouldn't break your teeth. Medieval dentistry consisted of just pull it out, so this was a big selling point. Traditional healers treasured jujubes for treating insomnia and anxiety, brewing the fruits into syrups and teas. Medieval candy makers also dried and sugared jujubes to create sweets that lasted months without spoiling. So popular that jujube eventually became the name for certain candies with no actual fruit in them. While jujubes traveled the Silk Road to reach Europe, another forgotten fruit had a much closer connection to silk production. Mulberry trees were planted everywhere in medieval Europe, but not for their juicy dark berries. They were grown to feed hungry silkworms. Silk production was a massive medieval industry, and silkworms refused to eat anything except mulberry leaves. No mulberry trees meant no silk, which meant no fancy clothes for the rich and powerful. Kings would literally go to war over silk, but the worms that made it were pickier eaters than a 5-year-old at a vegetable market. The silk connection made mulberry trees mandatory for any region wanting to participate in the lucrative trade. Italy and France had laws requiring landowners to plant specific numbers of mulberry trees based on their property size. Some places even taxed people who cut down mulberry trees without permission. The happy side effect? Tons of delicious berries that stained everything purple. Medieval nobles quickly realized they had an abundance of fruit and began using mulberries in wines, pies, and preserves. The berries ripened gradually over weeks rather than all at once, providing a steady supply through summer. Medieval laundry tip: never wear your best white tunic while picking mulberries unless you want to look like you've been attacked by a grape monster. The dark juice became a food coloring for everything from sauces to wines. It also made excellent ink for writing. Some medieval manuscripts were written with mulberry ink that still holds its color today, over 700 years later. While Europeans valued mulberries primarily for silk production, Native Americans across the Atlantic had been cultivating their own superfruit for centuries. Could a tiny berry help medieval communities survive harsh winters? The Saskatoon berry certainly did. These small blue-purple fruits might look like blueberries, but they packed an even bigger nutritional punch that made them essential to both European settlers and indigenous peoples. Saskatoon berries contain more protein, fat, and fiber than most fruits, making them a genuine medieval superfood. A single cup provided enough energy to keep working for hours during the brutal farming days when most people needed 4,000 calories just to get through their daily chores. Medieval health advice was usually things like try leeches or drink this mystery potion, but eating Saskatoon berries was actually good guidance. The berries grew wild across northern Europe and were later introduced to monastery gardens because of their reliability. Even in years when frost killed other crops, Saskatoon bushes stubbornly produced fruit. This dependability meant the difference between feast and famine in many remote communities. What made them truly special was their preservation quality. The berries could be dried and stored for years without losing their nutritional value. Many villages kept emergency stores of dried Saskatoons to ward off starvation during crop failures or sieges. Medieval winemakers particularly valued Saskatoon berries for creating sweet, high-alcohol content wines that kept well. The natural sugars fermented beautifully, creating drinks that warm bodies during cold winter months. The wine was so strong that medieval drinking songs about Saskatoon brew warned that 3 cups would have you talking to angels, or thinking you were one. While Saskatoon berries kept bodies healthy, another forgotten fruit was believed to keep evil spirits away. Fear drove medieval farmers to plant rowan trees more than any practical purpose. These trees, with their bright red berries, stood guard over homes, barns, and village squares across Europe, believed to offer magical protection against witches and evil spirits. Every part of the rowan tree had its place in medieval superstition. Branches were hung over doorways on May Day. Walking sticks made from rowan wood supposedly protected travelers on dark roads. Even the shape of the tiny star at the bottom of each berry was seen as a natural pentagram, a symbol of protection. Medieval home security systems consisted of one angry dog, a pointy stick, and several strategically placed rowan trees. Surprisingly effective against both bandits and witches. The berries themselves are intensely bitter when raw, so bitter that even birds avoid eating them until after the first frost softens and sweetens them. Medieval cooks discovered that cooking transformed these bitter berries into something delicious. Rowan berry jam became a winter staple, often paired with game meats or stirred into porridge. The high pectin content meant the berries easily formed thick preserves without adding extra ingredients. The preserves contained massive amounts of vitamin C, helping prevent scurvy during winter months. In northern regions, the berries were fermented into a strong spirit called rowan berry schnapps that burned going down but warmed you from the inside. Folk medicine claimed this drink could cure colds, rheumatism, and sore throats. Medieval drinking logic: if it burns your throat going down, it must be killing the illness too. Medical science wasn't exactly advanced. While rowan berries were too bitter to eat fresh, another forgotten medieval fruit was so sour, too sour to eat was the first thought of anyone biting into a slowberry. These small blue-black fruits grew on thorny blackthorn bushes throughout medieval Europe and would turn your mouth inside out if eaten raw. Yet despite their face-puckering sourness, sloes were harvested by the basketful every autumn. Why gather fruit too sour to eat? Because medieval people discovered something magical. Steeping sloes in alcohol created a delicious drink that would eventually evolve into modern sloe gin. The process was simple. Prick the berries, add them to spirits, then wait several months while the alcohol slowly extracted flavor, color, and sweetness. Medieval bartending school was basically, is it poisonous? No? Put it in alcohol and see what happens. Sloe happened to be one of their better experiments. Blackthorn hedges served double duty in medieval farming. The dense, thorny bushes created natural fencing that kept livestock contained while producing useful fruit. The wood was so hard and durable that it became the standard material for making cudgels and walking sticks. The berries had serious medicinal uses too. Sloe tonics treated everything from upset stomachs to fever. The high vitamin C content made by sloe preserves valuable winter medicine when fresh fruits are unavailable. Some medieval hospitals maintained special blackthorn gardens specifically for making remedies. Most fascinating was the timing ritual. Tradition held that sloes should only be harvested after the first frost, which helped break down the harsh tannins and made the berries more usable. Clever medieval farmers learned to cheat this system by picking the berries early and freezing them themselves. Medieval life hack: put sloes in the coldest part of your stone house for 2 weeks and pretend winter came early. Mother Nature never knew the difference. While sloe was the secret ingredient in medieval spirits, another forgotten fruit became so associated with drinking establishments. Step into any pub called the Checkers, and you're actually walking into a piece of forgotten fruit history. The checker fruit from the wild service tree was once so important to medieval drinking culture that countless pubs and taverns were named after it. These small brown fruits, speckled with lighter checks or spots, were the secret ingredient behind some of the most popular medieval drinks. Before hops became common for flavoring beer, checkers gave drinks a unique tangy flavor and natural preservative qualities. Tavern keepers would add dried or fermented checkers to barrels of ale, extending their shelf life while adding a distinctive taste that medieval drinkers craved. Medieval drink menus were simple. We have checker ale that doesn't make you sick immediately, and regular ale that might. Choose wisely. The fruits look similar to small pears or apples, but have a completely different flavor profile. Slightly tart with hints of date and raisin when fully ripened. Like medlars, they needed to be bledded or partially decomposed before eating, a process that converted their harsh tannins into natural sugars. Many medieval villages had a special checker tree in the town square or near the local tavern. These trees served as community gathering spots, and during harvest season, the whole village would collect the fruits to make community drinks for celebrations and festivals. A medieval job application for tavern work probably read, "Must be able to lift heavy barrels, serve rowdy customers, and know the difference between slightly rotten fruit we use on purpose and actually rotten fruit." While checkers flavored drinks that brought communities together, another forgotten fruit helped medieval travelers survive lonely journeys. Hackberries are small, sweet fruits grown on trees so tough they could survive drought, floods, and even fires. Medieval travelers carried dried hackberries on dangerous journeys through mountains and deserts, treating them like natural energy bars that could sustain life when no other food was available. Medieval survival guides would basically read, Step 1, find a hackberry tree. Step 2, don't die. Step 3, thank the hackberry tree for Step 2. Many medieval villages planted these trees as living insurance policies against famine. Their deep root systems made them nearly impossible to kill, even during the worst drought years. The fruits were typically eaten fresh or dried. Some regions ground dried hackberries into a powder for nutritious drinks or to stretch flour supplies during hard times. Medieval disaster preparedness kit: 1 sword, 1 shield, and a pouch of hackberries. 2 of these items might save your life, but only the hackberries were guaranteed to work. While hackberries helped travelers survive harsh journeys, another forgotten fruit was becoming increasingly rare even in medieval times. Myspilous fruits might win the award for most forgotten of all forgotten medieval fruits. This mysterious cousin of the common medlar confused even medieval farmers who couldn't decide if it was a separate fruit or just a weird variant. With its bizarre star-shaped calyx and unusual ripening process, Myspilous looked like something from another world. Medieval fruit identification went something like apple-shaped, apple, pear-shaped, pear, star-bottom brown thing that looks haunted. Let's call it Myspilous and back away slowly. The fruit was incredibly rare even in medieval times, grown mainly in specialized monastery gardens and noble estates. Unlike its more common medlar relative, Myspilous required specific soil conditions and careful tending, making it a status symbol for wealthy landowners who could afford expert gardeners. When properly ripened through bledding, controlled rotting, Myspilous developed a unique flavor profile described in medieval texts as honey wine with cinnamon. Its pulp was used in expensive desserts served at royal feasts. While Myspilous represented medieval luxury, the final forgotten fruit on our list was decidedly more common. Tiny, tart, and tough, crab apples would make modern apple lovers pucker in surprise. Yet these wild ancestors of our sweet supermarket apples were workhorses of medieval kitchens and farms. If modern apples are like spoiled rich kids who get everything handed to them, crab apples were their hardworking ancestors who walked uphill both ways in the snow. Too sour for eating fresh, crab apples shined when transformed through cooking. Their extreme tartness and high pectin content made them perfect for preserves and jellies. Medieval cooks mixed crab apple sauce with meat to cut through fatty dishes. The juice was fermented into a potent cider that kept well through winter. Even the wood was valuable, prized for its hardness and beautiful grain in tool handles. These 15 forgotten fruits reveal the ingenuity of medieval farmers who found value in every growing thing. Back in the Middle Ages, life was hard and food spoiled fast, but some smart peasants found foods that lasted forever. No fridge, no freezer, just old tricks that worked. These foods never went bad, even after years. Here are the ones they always kept stocked, just in case. And first on that list, the one thing that could save your food, your soup, and maybe even your life: salt. In medieval times, salt wasn't just that white stuff you sprinkle on French fries. It was practically worth its weight in gold. Kind of like how teenagers today treat their phone chargers. Peasants treasured salt above almost all other foods because it never expired. Never. Not in years, not in decades, not even in centuries. Archaeological digs have uncovered perfectly usable salt from ancient Roman times, over 1,000 years old, still ready to season your dinner. That's older than most grandparents' jokes and somehow more useful. When winter loomed and food grew scarce, salt became the medieval peasant's secret weapon against starvation. It was basically their version of a refrigerator, except it didn't beep when you left the door open too long. They'd rub it into strips of meat and fish, drawing out moisture that would otherwise let bacteria throw a party. This dry curing method transformed perishable foods into long-lasting provisions that could feed families for months. Medieval salt was so effective at preserving meat that some jerky from the 1300s probably still tastes better than modern airline food. Storage was simple but strategic. Most households kept their precious salt in small ceramic pots with tight-fitting lids, usually placed near the hearth where heat kept dampness away. If a medieval peasant dropped salt, they didn't just throw it over their shoulder for luck. They'd practically dive across the room to salvage every grain. The economics of salt shaped entire communities. In some regions, a sack of salt could buy you a cow. Today, we trade our cows for smartphones that expire faster than dairy products. Villages developed around salt mines and seawater evaporation ponds, with entire family lineages dedicated to its production. Most peasants could only afford to buy salt once or twice a year at seasonal markets, carefully rationing their supply through lean times. They tracked their salt usage more carefully than modern parents monitor their kids' screen time. During the harshest famines, salt became the difference between life and death. One medieval account describes how a family survived an entire winter on nothing but salted turnips and water. That's like living on nothing but kale smoothies, except medieval peasants didn't have Instagram to brag about their suffering. While that dinner menu sounds about as appealing as chewing on a boot, it kept them alive when their neighbors weren't so fortunate. The most resourceful peasants even used salt to preserve food they couldn't immediately eat, creating a medieval version of food storage banking. Their retirement plan wasn't a 401k, it was a well-stocked root cellar with enough salt to make a cardiologist faint. They'd salt away summer's bounty, knowing that when hunger came knocking in February, they had something even sweeter than salt to fall back on. Honey ranked as the medieval world's favorite sweetener, and unlike modern candy bars, it literally never expired. Scientists testing honey from ancient Egyptian tombs over 4,000 years old found it still perfectly edible. The world's oldest working sweetener that doesn't require a prescription. This golden liquid remained just as delicious after a few centuries as it was the day bees produced it. Why didn't it spoil? The secret lies in honey's chemistry. Its super low moisture content and natural acidity create an environment where bacteria simply give up and die. It's basically a bacteria retirement home where they check in but never check out. This made honey incredibly valuable to medieval peasants who couldn't just pop down to the corner store when they ran out of sugar. Medieval families stored their precious honey supply in sealed clay pots or wooden containers with tight-fitting lids. The containers were often kept in cool, dark corners of homes where temperature remained stable. Many households kept their honey pots near the ceiling, hanging from rafters to prevent curious children or hungry animals from raiding this liquid gold. The medieval version of putting cookies on the top shelf, except this treat could outlast the shelf itself. Beyond sweetening bland medieval porridge, honey served as a natural medicine cabinet. Its antibacterial properties made it effective for treating wounds and burns, a remedy so powerful that modern doctors sometimes still use medical-grade honey for treating stubborn infections. Medieval peasants would apply honey directly to cuts, knowing somehow that it killed germs before anybody even knew germs existed. Beekeeping wasn't just a hobby in medieval times, it was serious business. Entire villages sometimes pooled resources to maintain communal hives, sharing the honey harvest according to how much each family contributed to hive maintenance. Finding wild honey became such a valued skill that honey finders could earn special social status in some communities. As winter stretched on and food stores dwindled, a spoonful of honey could make even the most boring meal tolerable. But when even honey seemed too ordinary, medieval peasants turned to something with a bit more bite. Hard cheese became a medieval survival staple thanks to aging processes that turned milk into something nearly indestructible. Forget those soft, spreadable cheeses in your refrigerator. Medieval hard cheese could survive a year without refrigeration and still be perfectly edible. The secret? Time, salt, and patience. Lots of patience. Creating these long-lasting cheeses started with fresh milk from goats, sheep, or cows, depending on what animals the peasant family kept. After separating curds from whey, the cheesemaker pressed out every last drop of moisture and added generous amounts of salt. The salt quantities would make modern nutritionists clutch their blood pressure monitors in horror. But this heavy salting served an essential purpose. It created an environment where harmful bacteria couldn't survive. The aging process transformed these simple ingredients into something remarkable. For months, these cheese rounds would sit in cool, dark spaces, developing harder exteriors and concentrated flavors. As moisture evaporated, the texture changed completely. After 6 months to a year of aging, what began as soft curds became so dense and hard that peasants couldn't slice it. They had to crack or shave pieces off with knives. These cheeses were basically the medieval equivalent of rock candy, except they tasted like feet instead of sugar. Storage methods for these cheeses were cleverly practical. Most families wrapped their hard cheeses in clean cloth, sometimes sealed with beeswax, and hung them from the rafters in cool rooms. The hanging position kept them safe from rodents while allowing air circulation to prevent unwanted mold. Some regions developed special cheese storage cabinets with ventilation holes carved into specific patterns, early versions of cheese caves that still exist today. Hard cheese didn't just provide calories. It delivered crucial protein and fat during winter months when fresh meat was scarce. A typical family might save several wheels of hard cheese for winter, each representing gallons of precious summer milk preserved for later use. During the coldest months, thin shavings of this aged cheese added richness to otherwise bland soups and gruels. When properly aged and stored, these cheese wheels became so dense they could travel without spoiling. These cheeses were so hard you could use them as weapons, the original way to defend yourself. When grain harvests failed, medieval families turned to their pantry of imperishable foods, reaching next for something small but mighty. For medieval peasants, dried legumes were the ultimate survival food. These tiny nutritional powerhouses, beans, lentils, and peas, could remain edible for decades when properly stored. One study of legumes recovered from an ancient Egyptian tomb found they were still capable of sprouting after 3,000 years. While medieval storage wasn't quite that impressive, a family's bean supply could easily outlast the harshest winter or worst harvest failure. What made legumes so valuable was their perfect combination of shelf stability and nutrition. Unlike grains that provided mostly carbohydrates, legumes packed serious protein, crucial when meat was scarce or unaffordable. A medieval peasant working the fields could function on legume-based meals because they provided long-lasting energy and muscle-building nutrients. A medieval farmer eating beans for breakfast had the medieval equivalent of protein powder, minus the Instagram workout photos. Storing these life-saving foods required careful attention. After harvesting, peasants dried their beans and peas thoroughly in the sun, sometimes spending days turning and monitoring them. Any moisture left could trigger mold or sprouting. Once completely dried, they transferred the legumes to clay containers with tight-fitting lids or woven sacks hung high on walls, safely away from hungry rodents and dampness. Mice in medieval homes had to stare longingly at those hanging bean sacks like kids outside a candy store with empty pockets. Before eating, these rock-hard foods needed serious preparation. Medieval cooks soaked dried legumes overnight, then boiled them for hours in hanging pots above the hearth fire. This long cooking process softened the tough skins and neutralized certain compounds that could cause digestive distress. Without proper cooking, medieval bean soup could turn the family cottage into a methane production facility. Most medieval households combined legumes with whatever scraps of flavor they could find. Herbs from garden patches, bits of salt-preserved meat, or even just wild onions scavenged from nearby fields. The resulting thick stews became daily staples that filled bellies when little else was available. For elderly peasants with worn-down teeth, dried legumes posed a challenge. Many households ground their beans into rough flour that could be stirred into soups or mixed with other grains. While these tiny protein powerhouses kept medieval stomachs full, peasants still needed something to soak up all those hearty stews. Have you ever wondered why medieval peasants didn't just pop down to the local bakery every morning? Because they were busy making rye bread that could last for weeks. Black bread, as it was commonly called, stood as the foundation of the medieval diet across northern Europe. Unlike modern white bread that starts growing mold after a few days, medieval rye bread stayed edible for up to a month in cool conditions. The secret to this longevity wasn't preservatives with unpronounceable names. It was good old-fashioned sourdough fermentation. Medieval bakers maintained sourdough starters like precious family heirlooms, passing them down through generations. These living cultures contained beneficial bacteria and wild yeasts that naturally preserved the bread by creating an acidic environment where mold struggled to grow. Some medieval families treated their sourdough starters better than their in-laws. At least the starter produced something useful. The bread itself looked nothing like today's fluffy loaves. Dense, dark, and heavy enough to use as a doorstop, black bread had a distinctly sour flavor profile that modern taste testers often describe as challenging. The crust formed a hard protective shell that kept the inside from spoiling, while the dense crumb resisted mold growth far better than airy modern breads. Medieval bread was so dense that dropping a loaf could qualify as an occupational hazard for your toes. Baking day in a medieval household was a major event, usually happening once every week or two. Families would produce multiple large round loaves at once, using communal ovens in many villages where oven access was scheduled and shared. The first loaves eaten would be relatively soft, but as the days passed, the bread gradually hardened. By week 2 or 3, medieval diners would often need to dunk their bread in soup or ale just to avoid chipping a tooth. This practical food storage solution came with nutritional benefits too. The sourdough fermentation process broke down phytic acid in the rye grain, making minerals more available for absorption. It also pre-digested some complex carbohydrates, making the bread more nutritious than if they'd just ground the rye and baked it without fermentation. As bread slowly hardened beyond edibility, medieval households found other uses for it rather than waste a crumb. The truly stale pieces weren't tossed out. They were saved for thickening soups or feeding animals. When even black bread couldn't sustain a family through winter, they turned to protein that walked on 4 legs until it didn't. Dried meat might sound plain to us now, but for medieval peasants, it was the original fast food, ready to eat in an emergency, yet lasting for months without spoiling. When winter winds howled outside, a strip of preserved pork, beef, or goat could mean the difference between going hungry or having dinner. While modern refrigerators keep our steaks fresh for days, medieval preservation techniques kept meat edible for seasons. The drying process began immediately after slaughter, as families couldn't afford to waste an ounce of precious animal protein. First, they cut meat into thin strips or small chunks to increase surface area. Next came salt, lots of it. The meat sat for days completely buried in salt, which pulled moisture out while creating an environment where bacteria couldn't multiply. The amount of salt used would make a modern doctor faint faster than if you told them you have ice cream for breakfast every day. After the initial salt cure, peasants hung their meat in smokehouses, simple wooden structures where smoldering hardwood fires created smoke that deposited antimicrobial compounds into the meat while adding flavor. In regions without dedicated smokehouses, families suspended meat high in their cottages, usually near chimney openings where rising smoke could reach it. Some clever households built specialized rafters above cooking areas specifically designed for smoking meat. The slow drying process could take weeks, but the results lasted months. Different regions developed signature styles of preservation. Northern Europeans often cold smoked their meat at low temperatures over many days, while Mediterranean peasants used less smoke and more air drying in their warmer climate. In particularly damp regions, some families stored fully cured meat in barrels, completely buried in grain or dried peas to absorb any remaining moisture. The resulting preserved meat bore little resemblance to fresh cuts. Dark, dense, and intensely flavored, it could be eaten as is or added to stews and soups to provide rich protein. Medieval jerky was so tough that eating it counted as both dinner and a jaw workout. Travelers valued dried meat highly, carrying strips on journeys where its durability and concentrated nutrition made it the perfect travel companion. While meat hung from rafters, medieval cooks were already planning what to do with everything else, crafting survival foods that could last through the leanest times. Long before bouillon cubes lined grocery store shelves, medieval peasants created their own version of instant soup using bone broth cubes. This ingenious food preservation method turned animal bones, parts that might otherwise be discarded, into concentrated nutrition that could last for months without spoiling. The process started with collecting bones from whatever animals the family had eaten. Waste not, want not was more than just a saying in medieval times, it was survival. After meat had been removed for immediate eating or drying, bones went straight into the cooking pot. These weren't quick recipes. Medieval cooks simmered bones for hours, sometimes an entire day, extracting every bit of flavor, fat, and gelatin. A properly made medieval bone broth turned solid when cooled, thanks to the natural gelatin released from joints and marrow. This wasn't just a happy accident, it was essential for preservation. The resulting jiggly mass looked like something between modern Jell-O and that mysterious leftover container in the back of your fridge you're afraid to open. But this wobbling brown substance represented food security for hungry months ahead. To create portable, long-lasting cubes, medieval cooks poured their reduced broth into shallow wooden trays or clay dishes. After cooling completely, the solidified gelatin was cut into small blocks and dried near the hearth or in the sun until the moisture content was low enough to prevent spoilage. These dried broth cubes were basically medieval flavor bombs, except instead of blowing your mind, they kept you from starving. Storage was simple but effective. Most families wrapped their dried broth cubes in clean linen or stored them in covered clay pots. During winter months when fresh food was scarce, dropping one of these concentrated cubes into hot water created an instant nutritious soup. Adding whatever vegetables or grains were available turned this simple broth into a complete meal. The genius of bone broth cubes went beyond just preservation. They were lightweight, portable emergency food that could restore strength to someone weakened by hunger or illness. Medieval travelers sometimes carried these cubes on journeys, knowing that a life-sustaining hot meal was just a campfire away. While these humble cubes provided liquid nourishment, medieval people also valued foods that could be eaten without preparation during long journeys or hunting trips. Nature designed walnuts with their own preservation system, a hard protective shell that medieval peasants recognized as nature's perfect food container. These tough-shelled treasures became essential parts of winter food supplies because they could last over a year without any special treatment other than keeping them dry. No salting, smoking, or fermenting required. Just crack and eat. Walnut trees grew across much of Europe, though they were more common in southern regions, where the climate was milder. Medieval peasants would gather nuts during autumn harvests, competing with squirrels and birds for this valuable resource. Wild walnut gathering often became a community event, with families claiming favorite trees or groves year after year. Many households planted walnut trees near their homes specifically for food security, creating a legacy that would feed their grandchildren and beyond. After gathering, nuts were dried thoroughly to prevent mold, then stored in simple mesh sacks or loosely woven baskets that allowed air circulation. These containers were often hung from rafters or placed in cool, dry storage areas. Medieval nut storage operated on one simple principle: keep the mice out and the air flowing, or your winter protein stash becomes a rodent retirement home. The nutritional value of walnuts made them worth their weight in bread. Rich in fats and proteins, a handful of walnuts could provide lasting energy for hours of hard labor. Medieval peasants understood this instinctively, even without knowing about calories or nutrients. Parents would often set aside special stores of nuts for children during growth spurts or for pregnant women who needed extra nourishment. Walnuts weren't just eaten plain. Medieval cooks ground them into coarse flour to thicken sauces or mixed them with herbs and garlic to create rough pastes similar to modern pesto. Some regions enjoyed walnut-sweetened breads as special treats, using honey to bind crushed nuts into the dough. Grinding walnuts by hand was such hard work that medieval cooks probably had forearms like modern arm wrestlers. Beyond the dinner table, walnuts served another crucial role: medieval currency. In many regions, nuts were valuable enough to barter for other goods or services. A sack of quality walnuts could sometimes purchase items that coins couldn't, especially during winter when food became more precious than metal. When hunger struck between meals but cooking wasn't possible, these portable protein packages came to the rescue. But for longer preservation of other foods, medieval kitchens relied on something much more acidic to keep meals safe. Sour, sharp, and seemingly immortal, vinegar stood as one of medieval cooking's most valuable ingredients. Made from fermented wine, beer, or fruit juice, this acidic liquid never spoiled. It literally couldn't go bad because it was already bad in the best possible way. What started as a simple souring of alcohol transformed into a preservation superstar that protected other foods from decay. Medieval households produced vinegar almost accidentally at first. When wine or beer went sour, resourceful peasants discovered this tangy liquid could extend the life of vegetables, fruits, and even eggs by weeks or months. Soon, deliberate vinegar production became common practice. By allowing alcohol to sour in open-air barrels with special bacteria, families created their own supply of this preservation miracle. The science behind vinegar's power is straightforward. Its high acidity creates an environment where most harmful bacteria simply cannot survive. Medieval pickles probably killed more bacteria than their doctors did. This acidic environment transformed perishable summer vegetables into winter staples without a refrigerator in sight. Storage methods for vinegar were elegantly simple. Most households kept their supply in sealed ceramic jugs, wooden barrels, or glass bottles if they could afford them. The containers needed tight seals not to protect the vinegar, but to prevent its sharp odor from permeating the entire house. A medieval kitchen with an open vinegar container could clear sinuses faster than modern allergy medicine. Beyond food preservation, vinegar served multiple practical purposes. It cleaned tools, treated minor wounds, and even addressed lice infestations in human hair. Most impressive was vinegar's shelf life, indefinite when properly sealed. Archaeological discoveries have found sealed containers of Roman vinegar from nearly 2,000 years ago that remained perfectly usable. While vinegar helped preserve many foods, sometimes medieval peasants needed something safer to drink than potentially contaminated water. That's when they turned to a beverage that even children could safely consume. Don't drink the water wasn't just travel advice in medieval times. It was a survival strategy. All, a low-alcohol beer brewed in nearly every home, saved countless lives by providing a safe alternative to often contaminated water sources. Families didn't understand germ theory, but they knew from experience that people who drank ale instead of water from the village pond got sick less often. Unlike modern beer with its higher alcohol content, medieval ale was a humble, cloudy drink with just enough alcohol, usually 1 to 3%, to kill harmful bacteria while remaining appropriate for daily consumption by everyone, including children. The brewing process involved boiling, which killed pathogens, and fermentation, which created an environment where many harmful bacteria couldn't survive. Women dominated the brewing industry in early medieval periods, with the term alewife referring to female brewers who often sold surplus ale to neighbors. These enterprising alewives were the original craft beer influencers, except their marketing strategy involved a pole with a bush tied to it outside their door rather than Instagram posts. Most medieval ale contained a simple recipe of malted barley, water, and wild yeast. Hops, now standard in beer, weren't widely used until later periods. Instead, a mixture called gruel, containing herbs like bog myrtle, yarrow, and heather, provided flavor and some preservative qualities. Medieval ale probably tasted more like a weird herbal tea than modern beer, but when you're thirsty enough, even liquid bread tastes refreshing. The nutritional benefits of ale shouldn't be overlooked either. A quart of ale could provide up to 400 calories, significant energy for hardworking peasants. This liquid bread helped people survive when solid food was scarce, especially during winter months. For travelers journeying between villages, ale offered guaranteed hydration without the risk of unfamiliar water sources. But for those preparing to stay in one place through the cold months, another durable mixture of grains offered sustenance in a form that could sit on a shelf until hunger called. Porridge mix might sound boring to modern ears, but for medieval peasants, it was their version of instant food. A ready-to-cook mixture that required minimal preparation, yet delivered maximum survival value. This strategic combination of ground grains, dried herbs, and sometimes powdered root vegetables formed the backbone of daily nutrition across medieval Europe, especially when fresh food ran scarce. Creating the perfect porridge mix began with selecting grains. Oats dominated in northern regions where cold, wet conditions favored their growth, while barley and millet appeared more commonly in southern areas. After harvest, peasants dried these grains thoroughly, then processed them using hand-powered stone querns or community mills. Medieval teeth got such a workout from porridge that dentists would have gone out of business if medieval dentists had existed beyond the guy who also happened to be the blacksmith. What transformed mere ground grains into proper porridge mix was the addition of clever flavor enhancers. Dried herbs like thyme, sage, or mint added taste and slight medicinal benefits. Some regions incorporated dried fruit pieces or ground nuts into wealthier households' mixes. More commonly, peasants added dried and powdered wild vegetables to give the bland grains some character. Storage solutions for porridge mix were brilliantly simple. Most families kept their supply in tightly woven cloth sacks or sealed wooden containers, often hanging from rafters to keep rodents at bay. Preparation was so simple that medieval cooks could literally make breakfast half asleep. The original, "I haven't had my morning porridge yet" excuse for grumpiness. The true genius of porridge mix lay in its adaptability. In good times, it might include luxury additions like honey or milk. In lean times, hot water alone would suffice. This humble mixture sustained countless generations through harsh winters when little else was available to eat. But even when porridge wasn't enough, medieval peasants could always fall back on another grain that required minimal processing, yet offered maximum storage life. Tough, resilient, and harder to kill than a medieval legend, the whole barley earned its place in peasant storage bins through sheer stubbornness. This remarkably durable grain could survive conditions that would ruin other foods, thanks to its natural hull that provided built-in armor against insects, moisture, and spoilage. Medieval farmers valued barley for its ability to grow in poor soil and harsh conditions where other crops failed. After harvest, peasants dried barley thoroughly, then stored it in ceramic pots or woven sacks kept off the ground. The pests that would happily munch through other grain supplies often gave up on barley. Even medieval mice had standards about how hard they were willing to work for dinner. Cooking barley required serious commitment, hours of simmering before it softened enough to eat. A full belly of barley porridge could keep a medieval farmer plowing fields longer than modern office workers can stay awake during afternoon meetings. Barley served multiple purposes: ground into flour for flatbreads, added to soups, and most famously, sprouted to create malt for brewing ale when water became questionable. While barley required cooking facilities and time, medieval people also valued foods that could be prepared with minimal equipment. Made with just flour, salt, and water, no yeast needed, flatbread became the ultimate survival food for medieval travelers and those with limited cooking resources. It could be cooked anywhere you could make a fire, whether on heated stones, over open flames, or pressed against a clay oven wall. The secret to flatbread's impressive shelf life was its complete lack of moisture. Unlike raised bread, flatbread dried thoroughly during cooking. After cooling, these flat discs hardened into cracker-like rounds that could resist mold for weeks or months. Medieval flatbread was the original hardtack, with emphasis on hard. Bite into a month-old piece without soaking it first, and you'd be visiting the town tooth puller faster than you could say dental plan. Northern Europeans made theirs primarily from barley or rye flour, while Mediterranean cultures preferred wheat. Some bakers added dried herbs or seeds for flavor and nutrition. After cooling, flatbreads were stacked, folded, or rolled, then wrapped in linen cloths. The bread was usually stacked on high shelves, safe from children and pets, medieval childproofing at its finest. When hunger struck, flatbread could be eaten as is or quickly rehydrated by dipping in water, ale, or soup. While flatbread sustained bodies with its simple nutrition, medieval people also craved sweeter preserved foods to lift their spirits during dreary winters. Fruit leather brought sweetness to medieval winters long before grocery stores sold fruit roll-ups in plastic wrappers. Made from mashed berries or apples, this natural treat preserved summer's bounty when sugar was a luxury few could afford. Medieval families collected wild berries, plums, and fallen orchard fruits, cooking them down to a thick pulp before spreading the mixture on clean cloth or wooden boards to dry in the sun. The drying process concentrated natural sugars, creating chewy, intensely flavored sheets that could be rolled and stored for months. Kids today beg for candy at stores. Medieval children probably followed their parents around asking how many more days until the fruit leather was ready. Storage was remarkably simple. Once completely dried, fruit leather was rolled up and stored in linen bags, often hung from kitchen rafters. The high sugar content acted as a natural preservative, preventing most spoilage if kept dry. During winter celebrations or as special treats, small pieces were cut off and enjoyed as a rare sweet flavor in an otherwise bland diet. Travelers carried these concentrated fruit rolls on journeys, knowing a small piece could provide quick energy when needed. While sweet treats lifted spirits, medieval kitchens also preserved cooking fats for times when animals grew lean. Rendered animal fat served as medieval cooking oil with an incredible shelf life. After slaughtering animals in autumn, peasants carefully collected every scrap of fat, knowing it would provide essential calories and cooking medium during lean winter months. The rendering process was straightforward but crucial. Chunks of animal fat were slowly heated until they melted, allowing impurities to separate and be strained away. The resulting clear fat, once cooled, could be stored in sealed crocks or bladders for months without refrigeration. Medieval kitchens might have lacked fancy gadgets, but they discovered fat preservation long before spray cans of cooking oil existed. Properly rendered fat remained usable for half a year or more when kept cool and sealed from air. Different animals provided distinct types of cooking fat. Pork fat remained softer and was preferred for pastries and general cooking. Beef and sheep fat became hard when cool, making it ideal for longer storage and creating light sources. Some medieval kitchens had so many hanging fat containers that bumping your head meant getting both a headache and a greasy hairstyle. From salt to rendered fat completes a remarkable system of food preservation that allowed medieval people to survive through harsh winters and uncertain harvests, all without a single refrigerator in sight. Before battle, medieval soldiers needed more than weapons. They needed food that gave them strength. They didn't eat for fun. They ate to stay alive, fight harder, and survive the longest. These 10 powerful foods helped fuel men who were ready to risk everything. First up, boiled barley with salted fat. If you've ever complained about your morning oatmeal being bland, thank your lucky stars you weren't a medieval soldier. Before charging into battle, these warriors filled their bellies with the world's most boring yet effective breakfast, boiled barley mixed with chunks of salted animal fat. Talk about a meal that could both sustain you and make you question your career choices. Barley was the perfect warrior food because it grew almost anywhere. In cold regions, warm areas, even in poor soil. Armies could find it in nearly every territory they conquered. A single field could feed hundreds of fighters, making it the ultimate military crop. While modern soldiers get energy bars, medieval warriors got what looked like something your cat might cough up. The preparation was simple. Throw barley into massive pots, add water, and boil until mushy. No spices, no sweeteners, just plain mush. It looked so appetizing that prisoners would confess just to avoid another serving. The original truth serum wasn't torture. It was Wednesday's barley special. The real secret weapon was the fat mixed into it, typically salted pork fat, beef tallow, or goat fat. Each spoonful contained over 100 calories, adding serious energy reserves. A modern nutritionist would have a heart attack just looking at it. The first and only diet where extra fat was written on the prescription. A single bowl could keep a fighter energized from sunrise until well past noon. The combination of carbs from barley and energy from fat created perfect battle fuel. The texture was deliberately mushy, so exhausted soldiers could eat quickly without chewing. Medieval fast food meant exactly that. Food you could eat fast, not food that would make you fast. While this meal lacked flavor, it delivered results. After all, nobody ever carved a statue of a soldier holding up a victory salad. Speaking of strong-smelling foods that kept medieval warriors going, the next battlefield superfood packed such a powerful punch you could smell it coming from a mile away. The smell hit you before the enemy did. Medieval soldiers smeared a pungent mixture of crushed garlic and onions on almost everything they ate before battle. This potent paste served as both food and medicine, creating an army that could defeat enemies with their breath alone. Raw garlic contains a compound called allicin that forms only when the clove is crushed. Records from the 1300s show that military units received daily garlic rations. Knights got 6 cloves, while common soldiers received 3. The class system was alive and well, even in bad breath. Preparing the paste required nothing more than stones for crushing and maybe a splash of vinegar to preserve it. Soldiers carried small clay pots tied to their belts, ready for a quick energy boost during marches or before combat. Unlike modern energy drinks with fancy packaging, this medieval power-up came with a side effect of friends standing at least 10 feet away at all times. The paste wasn't just for energy, it helped keep soldiers alive. Garlic contains natural antibiotic properties that fought infections from battlefield wounds. Onions added vitamin C that prevented scurvy during long campaigns. When you couldn't shower for months and lived in close quarters with hundreds of other smelly men, anything that might keep sickness away was worth the social cost. Some spread it on bread, others mixed it into stews. The brave ate spoonfuls straight from their containers before battle. Medical texts claimed the mixture gave the body inner heat that protected against arrows and sword cuts. While it didn't stop steel, the confidence boost was real. Interestingly, enemy armies could often tell which fighting force they faced by smell alone. Spanish troops added extra garlic, while Northern Europeans preferred more onion. You could say medieval warfare was the original battle of the brands, except these brands made your eyes water from 50 paces. At least garlic and onions were recognizable as food. The next item on our menu was so basic and practical that modern people might mistake it for building materials rather than lunch. You might throw away bread when it gets hard or toss cheese that's turned a bit funky, but medieval soldiers treasured these exact foods. Old cheese and stale bread formed the backbone of battlefield nutrition for centuries, a combination so practical that entire wars were won on its crust. Hard cheeses were essential for military campaigns because they didn't spoil quickly. The aging process removes moisture and increases salt content, naturally preserving the food. Soldiers carried chunks wrapped in cloth or leather pouches, sometimes for weeks. By the time some battles ended, the cheese was so hard it could have been used as a backup weapon. The bread was equally sturdy. Bakers for military units deliberately overcooked it until dense and dry. Some armies created what we'd now recognize as hardtack, flour and water baked until rock solid. The dryness prevented mold, allowing bread to last for months. Modern dentists would shudder at the thought, but medieval soldiers simply had stronger jaws or fewer teeth to worry about. Soldiers often had to soak the hard bread in whatever liquid was available, water, ale, or stew, just to make it soft enough to chew without cracking teeth. Some used their daggers to shave thin pieces off loaves too hard to bite directly. The cheese, meanwhile, became more pungent with age, developing strong flavors that would make modern taste buds rebel. What made this combo brilliant was its practicality. Together, they provided carbohydrates, protein, fat, and calcium in one portable package. No cooking required. One English military document from 1386 claimed that 40 pounds of hard cheese could feed 100 men for 2 days during forced marches. The bread often served multiple purposes beyond food. Soldiers would use flat pieces as makeshift plates, eating surfaces, or even as emergency patches for holes in their boots. Truly, the first multi-purpose survival tool before Swiss Army knives were invented. When soldiers needed something to wash down their hard cheese and bread, they reached for a drink that would raise eyebrows at modern restaurants. Medieval soldiers rarely drank water. Instead, thick ale flowed through army camps, serving as the main source of hydration before battle. This medieval ale was closer to liquid porridge than the clear, fizzy drinks we pour today. It was the original meal in a mug, centuries before protein shakes made that sound appealing. The brewing process turned barley into a nutrient-rich drink through fermentation. Unlike today's filtered beers, medieval ale contained floating bits of grain, yeast, and whatever else fell into the brewing vat. The chunks floating in your cup weren't bugs. They were extra protein. Medieval quality control was simple. If it wasn't moving on its own, it was fine to drink. This thick drink solved the deadly water problem. In an age before anyone understood germs, the brewing process and alcohol content killed enough harmful bacteria to make ale safer than plain water. Medieval soldiers didn't know about microbiology, but they knew that water made you sick while ale made you happy. Early scientific research at its finest. A quart of ale contained roughly 500 calories, about a quarter of a soldier's daily needs in one mug. It delivered B vitamins that helped fighters maintain energy during battles. Soldiers didn't just drink their ale, they chewed it. It was the first energy drink that actually made you less athletic with every serving. The mild alcohol content helped calm pre-battle nerves without seriously impairing fighting ability. A saying from the time suggested that a cup of ale brings courage, a barrel brings defeat. It was the perfect amount of liquid courage, just enough to make you think charging toward sharp, pointy objects was a reasonable career choice. After filling up on thick ale, medieval soldiers still needed solid food with serious sustaining power. For that, they turned to something humble yet mighty that could be cooked in massive quantities over a single fire. Gather round the medieval army cooking pot to discover the humble food that fueled countless victories: stewed legumes. Lentils, beans, and peas boiled into thick, hearty mush became the backbone of military nutrition across Europe for over 1,000 years. Dried legumes were nearly indestructible. They could travel in cloth sacks for months without spoiling and survive rough wagon journeys. Supply wagons carried huge quantities as a single pound of dried beans expanded to feed 4 hungry soldiers once cooked. Military quartermasters loved this math. Less weight to transport meant faster-moving armies. The cooking method couldn't have been simpler. Large iron cauldrons were filled with water, handfuls of dried legumes were tossed in, and the whole mixture was left to boil for hours over campfires. The flavor was so exciting that soldiers sometimes fought over who got to guard the camp instead of going into battle. What legumes lacked in taste, they made up for in nutrition. These tiny seeds delivered serious protein, up to 25% by weight, making them comparable to meat in their ability to build and repair muscle. Their complex carbohydrates release energy slowly throughout the day, helping soldiers maintain strength during long battles. Different regions favored different legumes. Northern armies relied on hardy peas that grew even in poor soil. Mediterranean forces preferred various beans, while Eastern European troops often used lentils, which cooked faster when time was limited. Some clever commanders actually planted legume crops along planned invasion routes, creating living supply depots. Hot food was rare on campaigns, and a steaming bowl of bean stew could lift spirits even in miserable conditions. Nothing says ready for battle like an army that just finished a bean feast. The enemy could hear them coming from a mile away. The digestive side effects were so powerful that some military historians believe certain night ambushes were compromised by the unmistakable sounds and smells produced by legume-fueled troops. Nature's war drums were impossible to silence. When armies needed to supplement their stewed legumes with something more substantial for the strongest fighters, they turned to a food that was rare but prized on the battlefield. For a medieval soldier, finding meat on the bone was like discovering gold. While regular armies today might get beef stew or chicken, medieval fighters rarely saw fresh meat except before major battles or after victories. It was the ultimate power food saved for moments when strength mattered most. The menu was practical rather than fancy. Goat meat was prized for its ability to stay fresh longer in hot weather. Pork from wild boars or farm pigs provided more fat, which meant more energy. When times were truly desperate, horse meat appeared in cooking pots. The medieval soldier's butcher shop didn't have a seafood section or a vegan alternative corner. Cooking methods were limited by battlefield conditions. The most common approach was to roast meat on spits over open fires, allowing the fat to drip down and baste the meat naturally. When time allowed, troops would boil chunks in large cauldrons, creating a rich broth that could be sopped up with bread. Nothing went to waste. Bones were cracked open to access the nutrient-rich marrow inside. For longer campaigns, meat was preserved through salting or smoking. Strips would be packed in salt, then hung near fires to dry into a form of jerky. This technique produced tough but portable protein that could last for weeks. It was probably the only food in history that gave you a workout just by eating it. Different ranks received different cuts, naturally. Military leaders enjoyed prime sections like haunches or loins, while common soldiers usually received tougher cuts. A record from an English campaign in 1388 noted that knights received 1 pound of meat on battle mornings, while archers got half that amount. Many cultures believed that eating meat, especially from strong animals, transferred those animals' qualities to the warrior. Military leaders encouraged this belief, frequently describing meat as real food for real men before battles. Medieval motivational posters would have shown a bearded warrior holding a turkey leg instead of saying, "Hang in there." When meat wasn't available but soldiers still needed a filling meal for sustained energy, They turned to a humble but mighty food that served as the foundation of medieval military cuisine. What happens when you take grains like oats, rye, or barley, boil them into a soupy mess, and serve it to hungry soldiers? You get grain gruel, the most boring yet reliable food in medieval military history. This simple dish powered more conquests, defenses, and marches than any other food from the medieval period. Gruel differed from porridge mainly in its wetness. While porridge was thick enough to hold a spoon upright, gruel flowed like a thick soup. Army cooks would start with 1 part grain to 6 parts water, then adjust the ratio depending on how many mouths needed feeding. When times were especially tough, the gruel became so thin you could read battle plans through it. Making gruel required minimal skill. Grains would be tossed into cauldrons of water and boiled until they broke down, creating a starchy liquid. Unlike barley with fat, gruel was often flavored if possible. Common additions included salt, herbs gathered from nearby fields, or honey if the army was wealthy. Some military records from the 1300s mention purchasing barrels of honey specifically for gruel during winter campaigns. The beauty of gruel came from its adaptability. In northern regions, it was made with oats that could withstand colder climates. In Central Europe, rye gruel dominated troop meals. Mediterranean armies often used wheat when available, though this luxury was typically reserved for officers. Nutritionally, gruel had advantages over plain bread. The liquid cooking method unlocked nutrients in the grain that might otherwise pass through the body undigested. This meant hungry soldiers absorbed more calories from each handful of precious grain. Each soldier typically carried their own wooden bowl and spoon, lining up at the cooking pots when meals were ready. One surviving military manual from 1402 recommends that officers supervise gruel distribution to ensure fair portions for all ranks. The fact that they needed rules about sharing gruel tells you everything about how exciting medieval cuisine could be. "Please, sir, may I have some more watery grain soup?" said no one enthusiastically ever. The meal might have looked like dishwater, but it transformed ordinary farmers into soldiers who could march 20 miles, then fight for hours. When commanders wanted to boost morale with something sweeter than plain gruel, they turned to a rare treat that combined energy with pleasure for their chosen warriors. Not all medieval battlefield foods were bland mush or rock-hard bread. Honey cakes stood out as rare battlefield treats, sweet, energy-packed snacks reserved for knights or elite warriors before important battles. While common soldiers got gruel, knights got the medieval equivalent of a power bar. Except it actually tasted good. Medieval honey cakes combined honey with ground nuts and grain, usually barley, oats, or wheat. The mixture was formed into flat, dense discs about the size of a hockey puck. The first rule of nightclub was making sure you got your honey cake. A single cake could contain more than 600 calories, about a third of a day's energy needs for an active warrior. The combination of fast-acting sugar from honey and slower-burning fats from nuts created the perfect energy profile for combat. A medieval knight probably couldn't tell you about blood sugar spikes, but he knew the difference between quick energy and staying power. Their nutritionists were basically just guys who hadn't died yet. Some military units actually had the cakes blessed by priests before battle, believing this would transfer divine strength to whoever ate them. Apparently, God had a sweet tooth and preferred his prayer with a side of dessert. Commanders understood the psychological power of these treats. One English military record notes honey cakes being promised as rewards for the first soldiers to breach an enemy wall. Medieval performance bonuses didn't come with direct deposit, but they tasted a lot better than modern ones. Not all battlefield foods were so pleasant, however. For true dietary courage, some soldiers turned to a dish that tested even the strongest stomachs and supposedly gave fighters the strength of wild beasts. Now we come to the battlefield food that separated the men from the boys: spiced porridge mixed with animal blood. This hearty concoction was exactly what it sounds like. Hot grain porridge stirred together with fresh blood from pigs, cattle, or whatever animals were available for slaughter. It was basically breakfast cereal with a horror movie twist. This unusual dish wasn't served everywhere. It appeared mainly in northern European armies during harsh winters or before particularly difficult battles. The reasoning was simple. Blood added iron, protein, and what medieval people called living heat to the body. In the coldest regions, this extra warmth could mean the difference between fighting effectively and freezing on the battlefield. The preparation required careful timing. First, a thick porridge would be made from whatever grains were available, usually oats in Scotland and northern England or rye in Germanic regions. The hot porridge would then be mixed with fresh blood, creating a dark, rich mixture. Most modern cooking shows skip this recipe, which is probably for the best. Spices played a crucial role in making this intense food palatable. Records from the 1300s mention armies traveling with precious cinnamon, ginger, and pepper specifically for blood porridge. These warming spices were believed to enhance the heating properties of the blood and mask its metallic taste. Medieval medical thinking held that consuming blood transferred the strength and vitality of the animal to the warrior. A military medical text from 1412 recommends bull's blood specifically for soldiers who would be in the front lines of battle, claiming it would give them the charge of the bull and steadiness in the face of enemies. The dish provided remarkable nutrition. Modern analysis suggests a bowl of blood porridge could deliver up to 25 grams of protein and significant amounts of iron, zinc, and B vitamins. For soldiers facing iron deficiency from poor diets, the blood component could actually improve energy levels. Nothing motivates troops like the threat of punishment if they don't eat their blood breakfast. Eat your horrifying porridge or face consequences was apparently effective leadership in some armies. In some regions, this battlefield food evolved into more refined forms that persist today, including blood sausages, black pudding, and similar dishes still enjoyed across Europe. The modern version comes with far fewer battle cries and much better table manners. Military diets weren't only about adding strong foods. Keeping healthy during long campaigns required something that could prevent the dreaded diseases that often killed more soldiers than actual combat. The secret weapon in many medieval military campaigns wasn't a new sword or shield. It was fermented cabbage and pickled turnips. These humble vegetables helped keep armies alive during long winter campaigns when fresh food was nowhere to be found. Fermented cabbage, an early version of sauerkraut, became standard military food across Europe by the 1200s. Cabbage would be shredded, packed into barrels with salt, and pressed down. Natural bacteria would transform it into a tangy food that could last for months. Unlike fresh vegetables that went limp and sad after a few days, fermented cabbage maintained its crunch and attitude indefinitely, the cockroach of the vegetable world. In regions where cabbage was less common, turnips took center stage. These root vegetables were chopped, packed in salt brine, and left to pickle. The resulting food was tangy, crunchy, and filled with vitamin C. Military records from 1410 note specific wagons dedicated to transporting barrels of pickled vegetables behind troops. These foods solved one of the biggest killers in medieval armies, scurvy. This disease, caused by vitamin C deficiency, weakens the body, causes gums to bleed, and eventually leads to death. Armies that marched for months, especially in winter, often lost more men to scurvy than to enemy weapons. Death by bleeding gums was considerably less glorious than death by sword. Not the kind of end that got you into warrior heaven with a good story. The fermentation process actually increases nutrients. Properly fermented cabbage can contain up to 4 times more vitamin C than fresh cabbage, a crucial difference during long winter campaigns. A daily handful provided enough to keep soldiers functioning. These foods were distributed in a variety of ways. Sometimes soldiers received daily rations of pickled vegetables. In other cases, communal barrels traveled with the troops, with each fighter expected to help themselves to a portion daily. Military commanders might not have understood the exact science, but they observed that troops who ate these foods regularly stayed healthier. Soldiers had mixed feelings about these pungent preserved vegetables. Medieval military wisdom boiled down to, eat your stinky vegetables or die a toothless death. The tradition of soldiers relying on preserved vegetables continued for centuries. Even into the 1700s, British naval vessels carried sauerkraut on long voyages to prevent scurvy among sailors. As we finish our journey through medieval battlefield nutrition, it's clear that these warriors understood something important. Food wasn't just fuel, but a strategic resource as valuable as any weapon.